Among the many sections that existed inside Birkenau, one area was known as the women's camp. Here, beginning in 1942, thousands of women from across occupied Europe were imprisoned inside a fence compound that formed a distinct section within the larger camp. They arrived from many different countries. Some had been deported from ghettos in Poland. Others came from France, the Netherlands, Germany, and other parts of Europe that had fallen under Nazi control. Each transport brought women who had lived very different lives before the war. Teachers, factory workers, mothers, daughters, students, and professionals were suddenly brought together inside a place where identity was reduced to a number and survival depended on adapting to a system designed to control every moment of daily life. The women's camp inside Birkenau quickly became one of the largest sections of the Auschwitz complex. Rows of wooden barracks stretched across the compound, surrounded by electrified fences and guarded by watchtowers. Inside these barracks, thousands of prisoners lived under conditions shaped by overcrowding, limited food, forced labor, and the strict discipline enforced by the SS administration. Yet within this harsh environment, women formed communities, shared information, and sometimes supported one another in small ways that helped them endure the routines of camp life. In this documentary, we will explore the complete history of the women's camp inside Birkenau. And before we begin, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to In&Out Nazi Germany, and let me know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Every story, every memory, and every place matters. And together we keep history alive. Now let's begin. Chapter 1, Segment 1. The landscape of Birkenau. The area that would eventually become known as Birkenau began as a quiet rural landscape in southern Poland, a region characterized by open fields, scattered farms, narrow dirt roads, and small villages that had existed for generations before the events of the Second World War transformed the area into one of the most recognized sites associated with the history of the Holocaust. Before the arrival of the concentration camp system, the land near the village of Brzezinka, located only a few kilometers from the town of Auschwitz, consisted largely of marshy ground and agricultural fields that supported the local population through farming and livestock. Small wooden houses and farm buildings dotted the landscape, and the rhythm of life followed the seasonal patterns common to rural communities throughout the region. This quiet environment changed dramatically after 1939, when Nazi Germany invaded Poland and incorporated the territory into the expanding administrative structure of the German Reich. The town of Auschwitz was renamed Auschwitz, and the surrounding area soon became the location for a new concentration camp established by the SS in 1940. Initially, the main Auschwitz camp was created within former Polish military barracks located on the outskirts of the town. However, as the prisoner population increased and the camp system expanded, the SS leadership responsible for the concentration camps began searching for additional space where a much larger facility could be constructed. Their attention turned to the rural land near Brzezinka, where wide fields and open ground offered the possibility of building a new camp on a far greater scale. Beginning in 1941, German authorities ordered the local Polish population living in the village and surrounding farms to leave the area. Houses were emptied, property was confiscated, and the landscape was gradually cleared in preparation for the construction of what would become Auschwitz-Birkenau. Once the residents had been removed, the SS began transforming the fields and marshland into a massive construction site. Prisoners from the main Auschwitz camp were forced to perform much of the early labor required to build the new facility. They cleared vegetation, leveled the ground, and dug drainage ditches designed to stabilize the soft soil that covered large sections of the land. The work was physically demanding and often carried out under difficult conditions, as the region's marshy terrain created constant challenges for the construction teams attempting to establish permanent structures. Despite these difficulties, the SS administration continued expanding the project, determined to create a camp that could hold tens of thousands of prisoners. Over time, rows of wooden barracks began appearing across the fields, forming the basic structure of the new camp. These barracks were arranged in long lines separated by gravel paths and open spaces that allowed guards to observe movement within the camp. Fences constructed from electrified barbed wire were erected around the perimeter, and watchtowers were placed at intervals to ensure that guards stationed above the camp could monitor the entire area. The layout of Birkenau was designed according to principles that allowed the SS administration to maintain control over a large prisoner population while also accommodating the rapid expansion that was expected as deportations from across Europe increased. As construction continued, the camp was divided into sections, each separated by internal fences and gates that regulated the movement of prisoners from one part of the complex to another. These sections included areas designated for different categories of prisoners, as well as administrative zones used by the camp authorities. Among these sections would later be the women's camp, an area where thousands of female prisoners were held within the larger structure of Birkenau. The placement of this section reflected the broader organizational approach used by the SS when designing the camp complex. By separating different groups of prisoners into distinct compounds, the administration could manage the population more easily while maintaining strict discipline across the camp. Each compound contained rows of barracks surrounded by fences and connected to the main camp roads that ran through the complex. The roads themselves were carefully positioned to allow guards to move quickly between different sections of the camp while supervising prisoner labor detachments traveling to work sites. As Birkenau grew larger, railway infrastructure also became an important part of the landscape. Tracks connected the camp to regional rail lines, allowing trains carrying deportees to reach the area directly. The arrival of these trains would later become one of the most recognizable elements associated with Birkenau's history. Yet, at the time of the camp's early construction, the focus of the SS administration remained on building the physical infrastructure required to support the massive camp they envisioned. The transformation of the quiet countryside near Brzezinka into a vast concentration camp complex was therefore not a sudden event but a gradual process carried out over many months. Each stage of construction brought new buildings, fences, and administrative facilities that expanded the boundaries of the camp across the surrounding fields. The result was a landscape that had been completely reshaped by the policies of the Nazi regime. Where farms and village houses had once stood, rows of barracks and watchtowers now marked the horizon. Gravel roads replaced rural paths, and electrified fences enclosed areas where thousands of prisoners would soon live under the control of the SS. For those who arrived at Birkenau in the years that followed, the first impression of the camp was often shaped by this environment. The long lines of wooden barracks stretching across the open ground, the watchtowers rising above the fences, and the vast scale of the complex created a visual image that reflected the enormous size of the camp system established there. Within this environment, the women's camp would soon take shape as one of the major sections of Birkenau, forming a space where the daily lives of thousands of imprisoned women would unfold under the same structures of surveillance, discipline, and forced labor that defined the broader Auschwitz complex. The landscape of Birkenau therefore formed the physical setting in which the history of the women's camp would take place, a landscape shaped by the deliberate transformation of rural land into one of the largest concentration camp complexes of the Second World War. Chapter 1, Segment 2. The Design and Layout of Birkenau. As the construction of Birkenau progressed through 1941 and 1942, the new camp began to take on a distinctive physical form that reflected both the administrative planning of the SS and the logistical requirements of managing an enormous prisoner population. The camp was not built randomly across the fields near the village of Brzezinka. Instead, its layout followed a structured plan that allowed the authorities to divide the complex into multiple sections, each surrounded by fences and monitored by guards positioned in watchtowers along the perimeter. These sections created separate compounds where different groups of prisoners could be housed while still remaining part of the larger camp system. Long straight roads ran through the center of the complex, forming a grid that connected the various compounds and allowed guards to move easily between them. Gravel paths extended outward from these main roads toward the rows of wooden barracks that filled each compound. From above, the arrangement created a pattern of rectangular blocks across the open landscape, with fences marking the boundaries between sections and watchtowers, providing constant observation points over the entire area. This design allowed the SS administration to control movement within the camp while maintaining visibility across large distances. Prisoners moving between barracks, work assignments, and roll call areas could be observed by guards stationed both on the ground and in elevated towers. The fences themselves were constructed from multiple rows of barbed wire, often electrified, creating barriers that separated the prisoners from the outside world and from other sections of the camp. The watchtowers placed at intervals along the outer fence line were tall wooden structures equipped with platforms where guards could monitor the campgrounds. From these towers, the guards had a wide view of the landscape, ensuring that any attempt to approach the fences or move into restricted areas could be quickly detected. The interior of each compound was organized around the barracks where prisoners lived. These buildings were typically constructed from wood and arranged in long parallel rows. Inside, the space was divided into sections filled with wooden bunks stacked in tiers. Each barrack was designed to hold large numbers of prisoners, reflecting the expectation that the camp population would continue to grow as deportations increased during the war. The layout of the barracks created narrow aisles between sleeping areas, leaving limited space for movement inside the buildings. Outside the barracks, open areas served as assembly grounds where prisoners gathered during roll calls conducted by the camp authorities. These roll call areas were positioned so that guards could easily monitor the assembled groups of prisoners while administrative personnel recorded the numbers present. Because the camp population was so large, these roll calls often involved thousands of individuals standing in formation within the compounds. The organization of the compounds also included buildings used for administration, storage, kitchens, and other facilities required to support daily operations within the camp. Kitchens prepared the limited food rations distributed to prisoners, while warehouses stored supplies and confiscated belongings taken from those who arrived in transports. Roads within the camp were designed to accommodate both prisoner movements and the vehicles used by the SS administration. Guards patrolled these roads while supervising work details and ensuring that the routines of camp life continued according to the schedules established by the authorities. As Birkenau expanded, additional compounds were constructed to house specific categories of prisoners. One of these sections was designated as the women's camp, where female prisoners were held within their own fenced area inside the larger complex. This compound was arranged in the same general pattern used throughout Birkenau, with rows of barracks surrounded by fences and connected by gravel paths leading to the main camp roads. The women's camp quickly became one of the largest sections of Birkenau as transports of female prisoners arrived from different parts of Europe. The design of this compound allowed the camp administration to manage the population through the same procedures used elsewhere in the complex, including roll calls, work assignments, and surveillance by guards and prisoner functionaries. The surrounding landscape of Birkenau also played a role in shaping the experience of those who arrived there. The camp stood within a wide open area where the horizon could be seen beyond the fences. Yet the electrified barriers and watchtowers created a constant reminder that prisoners remained confined within the camp boundaries. During different seasons, the appearance of the landscape changed as snow covered the fields in winter and dust rose from the roads during the dry months of summer. Regardless of the weather, the physical layout of the camp remained the same, with its orderly rows of barracks and fences extending across the fields. The railway lines that connected Birkenau to the wider transportation network were another important feature of the camp's design. Trains carrying deportees arrived at the camp through rail routes that linked the region to major cities and occupied territories throughout Europe. The presence of these railway connections meant that Birkenau functioned as a central point within a much larger system of deportations organized by the Nazi regime. As the trains arrived, prisoners were directed through procedures controlled by SS personnel before being assigned to different sections of the camp. Over time, the layout of Birkenau became one of the most recognizable aspects of the Auschwitz complex. The long rows of barracks, the fences and watchtowers, and the railway tracks that led into the camp formed a landscape shaped entirely by the policies and decisions of the Nazi authorities who designed and operated the concentration camp system. Within this carefully organized environment, the women's camp existed as a distinct compound where thousands of female prisoners lived under the same conditions of surveillance and discipline that defined life throughout Birkenau. The design of the camp, therefore, played a crucial role in shaping the experiences of those who were imprisoned there, providing the physical framework within which the daily routines, labor assignments, and social interactions of the camp unfolded. Chapter 1, Segment 3. The environment surrounding the women's camp. Within the vast layout of Birkenau, the women's camp existed as a clearly defined compound that formed part of the broader system of fence sections spread across the landscape. Although it functioned as its own controlled area within the camp, the environment surrounding it was shaped by the same physical features that defined Birkenau as a whole. Long rows of wooden barracks stretched across the open ground, separated by gravel paths and enclosed by barbed wire fences that marked the boundaries between different compounds. Watchtowers stood at intervals along the outer perimeter, allowing guards stationed above the camp to observe the movements of prisoners within the fenced sections below. For the women who were imprisoned there, the surrounding environment created a daily visual reminder of the scale and structure of the camp complex in which they lived. When prisoners stepped outside the barracks, they could see the wide open spaces that lay between the rows of buildings and the fences that enclosed the compound. Beyond those fences, additional barracks and compounds extended across the fields of Birkenau, forming a landscape that seemed to stretch endlessly across the flat ground near the village of Brzezinka. The camp had been built on marshy land that had required extensive drainage work during its construction, and although trenches and channels had been dug to control water flow, the ground could still become muddy after rain or snow. During the colder months of the year, snow often covered the barracks' roofs and the gravel roads that ran between the compounds, while in warmer seasons dust rose from the dry paths as prisoners marched to work assignments or assembled for roll calls. These seasonal changes shaped the physical experience of life within the camp environment. Yet the fundamental structure of the compound remained constant regardless of weather conditions. The barracks themselves formed the central features of the women's camp. Constructed primarily from wood, they were arranged in long parallel rows that allowed guards to monitor activity between the buildings. Each barrack contained rows of wooden bunks stacked in tiers, where prisoners slept in crowded conditions. Narrow aisles ran between the bunks, and small windows allowed limited light to enter the interior space. Outside the barracks, open areas served as assembly grounds where prisoners gathered during roll calls conducted by the camp authorities. These roll calls required inmates to stand in formation while guards counted the population and compared the results with administrative records. Because the women's camp held thousands of prisoners, these assemblies often filled the open spaces between the barracks with long lines of individuals waiting for the count to be completed. The fences surrounding the compound were constructed from multiple rows of barbed wire attached to wooden or metal posts. In many sections, the wires were electrified, creating a barrier that prisoners were not permitted to approach. Guards stationed in watchtowers monitored these fences continuously, ensuring that the boundaries of the compound remained secure. The towers themselves were elevated structures with platforms where armed guards could observe large sections of the camp. From these positions, they had a clear view of the barracks rows, the assembly grounds, and the roads that connected the different compounds within Birkenau. The presence of these watchtowers reinforced the sense that the camp environment was under constant surveillance. The roads that ran through Birkenau connected the women's camp to other sections of the complex. These roads were used by guards moving between compounds as well as by prisoner work detachments marching to labor assignments located either within the camp or at nearby sites. For prisoners living in the women's camp, these roads represented both routes of daily movement and visible reminders of the larger camp system surrounding them. When groups of prisoners marched along these paths under guard supervision, they could see other compounds where different groups of inmates lived under similar conditions. In this way, the environment of the women's camp was never entirely isolated from the rest of Birkenau. The physical layout allowed glimpses of the broader camp structure even while movement between compounds remained strictly controlled. Beyond the fences of the camp complex lay the rural landscape that had once been the site of villages and farms before the area was cleared for construction. Although the camp authorities had removed many of the original buildings during the creation of Birkenau, traces of the earlier landscape remained in the surrounding fields and distant tree lines. For prisoners inside the camp, the sight of these distant features could serve as reminders that the world beyond the fences continued to exist even while they remained confined within the compound. Yet the electrified barriers and constant guard presence ensured that the prisoners remained separated from that outside world. The environment of the women's camp was therefore defined by both its internal structure and its relationship to the larger landscape of Birkenau. Inside the compound, rows of barracks, fences, and assembly grounds formed the spaces where daily life unfolded. Outside the compound, the vast network of additional camps and the surrounding countryside created a broader setting that framed the experience of imprisonment. Together, these elements formed the physical environment in which thousands of women lived during their time in Auschwitz-Birkenau, shaping the visual and spatial experience of life within one of the most extensive concentration camp complexes established during the war. Chapter 2, Segment 1. The creation of the women's camp. The women's camp inside Birkenau did not exist during the earliest phase of Auschwitz's development, and its creation reflected the changing policies of the Nazi regime as deportations across occupied Europe intensified and the concentration camp system expanded in both size and function during the early years of the Second World War. When Auschwitz was first established in 1940, the camp population consisted almost entirely of male prisoners, many of whom were political detainees from occupied Poland. The original camp, later known as Auschwitz-I, had been constructed within former military barracks located near the town of Auschwitz, and the administrative structure created there was designed primarily to manage male prisoners assigned to labor and detention within the camp system. However, as the war progressed and the German authorities began implementing broader policies of deportation affecting populations across Europe, the number of individuals being transported to concentration camps increased dramatically. This change forced the SS leadership responsible for the camp network to reconsider how the system would accommodate different groups of prisoners, including women who were increasingly being deported to camps under Nazi control. By 1942, Auschwitz had already begun expanding beyond the original barracks complex through the construction of Auschwitz-II-Birkenau, a vast new camp located several kilometers away in the fields near the village of Brzezinka. Birkenau had been designed from the beginning as a much larger facility capable of holding tens of thousands of prisoners, and its layout allowed the SS administration to divide the camp into multiple fenced compounds dedicated to different categories of inmates. Within this growing complex, plans were made to establish a separate area where female prisoners could be housed under the same administrative structure that governed the rest of the camp. The decision to create the women's camp was therefore closely connected to the broader expansion of Birkenau itself. As new transports of prisoners arrived from across Europe, the camp authorities required a designated compound where women could be registered, housed, and assigned to labor within the system. The location chosen for the women's camp was within the Birkenau complex, where rows of wooden barracks were already being constructed as part of the larger building project that transformed the former rural landscape into an enormous concentration camp. During the early stages of the women's camp's existence, female prisoners were transferred from other camps within the Nazi concentration camp network. One of the most significant transfers occurred in March 1942, when groups of women were transported from Ravensbrück, the primary concentration camp for women located in Germany. These prisoners were brought to Auschwitz to form the initial population of the new women's camp. Upon arrival, they were subjected to the same registration procedures that had been established for other inmates entering the camp system. Each prisoner received an identification number that was recorded in the administrative records maintained by the SS, and these numbers became the primary means by which the camp authorities tracked individuals within the complex. After registration, the women were assigned to barracks located within the fenced compound designated as the women's camp. At first, the facilities were still under construction, and conditions were difficult as the camp infrastructure struggled to keep pace with the increasing number of prisoners arriving in transports. The barracks themselves were simple wooden structures arranged in long rows separated by gravel paths. Inside each building, wooden bunks stacked in tiers provided sleeping spaces for large numbers of prisoners, reflecting the expectation that the camp population would continue growing as deportations increased. As more transports arrived, the number of women held within the compound quickly expanded. Many of the new arrivals were deported from ghettos or communities across occupied Europe, and the population of the women's camp soon included prisoners from Poland, Germany, France, the Netherlands, Slovakia, and other regions affected by Nazi occupation policies. Each group brought with it different languages, cultural backgrounds, and personal histories. Yet once inside the camp, they were subjected to the same rules and routines that governed daily life in Birkenau. The establishment of the women's camp also required the creation of a supervisory structure within the compound. Female guards from the SS were assigned to oversee the section, working alongside male SS officers who remained responsible for the broader administration of the Auschwitz complex. These guards enforced the rules established by the camp authorities, supervised roll calls, and monitored the activities of prisoners within the barracks and work details. In addition to the guards, the camp administration appointed prisoner functionaries who were responsible for maintaining order inside the barracks and assisting with tasks such as organizing food distribution or coordinating work assignments. These prisoner functionaries were themselves inmates, selected by the SS to carry out certain responsibilities within the camp hierarchy. As the women's camp continued to grow throughout 1942 and 1943, it became one of the largest sections of Birkenau. Thousands of women were held within its fences at any given time, and the compound developed into a central part of the Auschwitz complex. The daily routines established there mirrored those of other sections of the camp. Prisoners assembled for roll calls, marched to labor assignments, and returned to their barracks at the end of the day under the supervision of guards and prisoner functionaries. Within this environment, the women's camp functioned as both a living space and a labor pool where prisoners were integrated into the broader system of forced labor that supported construction projects, industrial operations, and camp maintenance tasks throughout the Auschwitz network. The creation of the women's camp, therefore, marked an important stage in the expansion of Birkenau and the evolution of Auschwitz as a whole. What had begun as a camp primarily designed for male prisoners gradually developed into a complex capable of holding diverse groups of detainees from across Europe. The fenced compound that formed the women's camp became one of the most significant parts of this system, shaping the experiences of thousands of female prisoners who arrived there during the years of the war. Chapter 2, Segment 2. The first women arrive in Birkenau. The early months of the women's camp at Birkenau were marked by a period of rapid expansion and uncertainty as the first transports of female prisoners arrived and the infrastructure of the compound struggled to adapt to the growing population that the SS administration had begun directing toward Auschwitz. When the initial groups of women were transferred to the camp in 1942, The facilities designated for their accommodation were still in the early stages of development. Barracks had been constructed, but many were incomplete or lacking the basic supplies needed to support the large numbers of prisoners who were soon expected to fill them. The women who arrived during this period therefore entered an environment that was still being organized and expanded around them. One of the earliest and most significant groups of women brought to Auschwitz came from the concentration camp at Ravensbrück in Germany. Ravensbrück had already been established as the primary camp for female prisoners within the Nazi concentration camp system, and the transfer of women from there to Birkenau represented an administrative decision to expand the role of Auschwitz as a central location within the broader network of camps. In March 1942, several transports carrying female prisoners arrived at the camp, and these women formed the first core population of the new compound that would become known as the women's camp. Many of these prisoners had already experienced imprisonment within the concentration camp system before arriving at Auschwitz, and their presence played an important role in shaping the early structure of the women's camp. Upon arrival, the women were subjected to registration procedures similar to those imposed on other prisoners entering Auschwitz. They were processed by SS personnel who recorded their identities in administrative registers and assigned them identification numbers that replaced their names within the camp records. These numbers were often marked on the clothing issued to prisoners and used by the administration to track individuals as they moved through the routines of camp life. After registration, the newly arrived prisoners were directed into the barracks assigned to the women's camp. The buildings they entered were wooden structures arranged in rows within the fenced compound that formed the section of Birkenau designated for female inmates. Inside the barracks, rows of wooden bunks were stacked in tiers, creating sleeping areas where large numbers of prisoners were expected to rest each night. Because the camp population expanded quickly during this period, the barracks soon became crowded as additional transports of women arrived from different parts of occupied Europe. Each transport brought prisoners from communities that had been targeted by Nazi deportation policies. Women arrived from Poland, Slovakia, France, Germany, and other territories affected by the war. Some had previously lived in ghettos established by the German authorities, while others had been arrested during political operations or deported directly from their homes and communities. The diversity of backgrounds among these prisoners meant that the women's camp soon included individuals who spoke different languages and came from varied cultural environments. Despite these differences, the conditions of life inside the camp placed them within the same system of rules and routines imposed by the SS administration. As the population grew, the daily structure of the women's camp began to take shape. Each morning prisoners assembled for roll call in the open areas between the barracks. During these assemblies, the guards and administrative personnel counted the number of prisoners present to ensure that it matched the official records maintained by the camp authorities. These roll calls were an essential part of the administrative system that governed the camp, and they reinforced the discipline expected from the prisoner population. After roll call, many prisoners were assigned to work details that took them either within the camp complex or to nearby sites where labor was required. Some women worked in tasks connected to camp maintenance, such as cleaning barracks or assisting in kitchen areas where food rations were prepared. Others were assigned to construction projects that continued expanding the infrastructure of Birkenau. These projects included building new barracks, improving drainage systems across the marshy land, and constructing roads that connected different sections of the camp. In addition to labor within the camp, certain groups of prisoners were sent to nearby facilities where they worked in factories or agricultural areas connected to the broader Auschwitz labor system. These assignments reflected the growing role of forced labor within the concentration camp network as the war progressed. The supervision of the women's camp involved both male and female SS personnel. Female guards were assigned to monitor the daily activities of prisoners within the compound, while male SS officers remained responsible for the overall administration of the Auschwitz complex. Within the barracks themselves, prisoner functionaries were appointed to maintain order and assist in organizing daily routines. These individuals were selected from among the prisoner population and given responsibilities such as coordinating roll calls, distributing food rations, or reporting issues within the barracks to the guards. This hierarchical structure allowed the SS administration to manage the large number of prisoners living in the compound while maintaining strict discipline across the camp. As the months passed and new transports continued arriving, the women's camp grew into one of the largest sections of Birkenau. Thousands of women were now held within the fenced compound, and the rows of barracks became filled with prisoners who had been deported from across Europe. The early period of the camp's development therefore represented a time when the structure of the women's camp was being formed. The routines of roll calls, labor assignments, and barracks life gradually became established as the SS administration integrated the new compound into the broader Auschwitz system. Through these processes, the women's camp evolved from a newly created section of Birkenau into a major part of the camp complex, shaping the experiences of the thousands of women who would pass through its gates during the years of the war. Chapter 2, Segment 3. The Rapid Growth of the Women's Camp. As the year 1942 progressed, the women's camp at Birkenau expanded rapidly, reflecting the broader escalation of deportations carried out by Nazi authorities across occupied Europe. What had begun as a newly established compound intended to house the first groups of female prisoners soon developed into one of the largest sections within the Auschwitz complex. The arrival of new transports from different regions meant that the population of the women's camp increased month after month, placing growing pressure on the infrastructure that had been constructed only recently. Barracks that had been designed to accommodate large numbers of prisoners were quickly filled, and the compound became increasingly crowded as additional women were brought to the camp. This expansion was closely connected to the evolving role of Auschwitz within the Nazi concentration camp system. As deportation policies intensified during the war, Auschwitz became one of the central destinations for transports arriving from across the continent. The railway connections linking the camp to major cities and occupied territories allowed trains carrying prisoners to arrive regularly, and each arrival required the camp administration to process, register, and assign individuals within the expanding camp complex. The women's camp therefore became an important component of the administrative structure used to manage the growing prisoner population. New arrivals were brought into the compound after undergoing registration procedures that recorded their identities and assigned them identification numbers used within the camp records. Once registered, the prisoners were directed toward the barracks that formed the living quarters of the women's camp. Inside these buildings, rows of wooden bunks provided sleeping spaces arranged in tiers. The bunks were designed to hold multiple prisoners, and as the population grew, the available space inside the barracks became increasingly limited. Women often shared sleeping areas with several others, reflecting the overcrowded conditions that developed as more transports arrived. The compound itself was organized according to the same principles used throughout Birkenau. Barbed wire fences surrounded the area, and watchtowers positioned along the perimeter allowed guards to observe the entire section of the camp. Within the compound, gravel paths connected the rows of barracks to the central assembly areas, where prisoners gathered for roll calls conducted by the camp authorities. These roll calls became one of the defining routines of daily life in the women's camp. Each morning and evening, prisoners were required to stand in formation while guards and administrative personnel counted the population and compared the numbers with official records. Because the number of prisoners increased so rapidly during this period, these assemblies often involved thousands of women standing together within the compound. The expansion of the women's camp also required the development of a more structured system of supervision and organization within the compound. Female guards were assigned to oversee the daily activities of prisoners, enforcing the rules established by the SS administration and supervising work assignments carried out by the inmates. At the same time, prisoner functionaries were appointed to assist with managing the internal routines of the barracks. These functionaries were responsible for maintaining order within the buildings, organizing the distribution of food rations, and ensuring that prisoners followed the schedules established by the camp authorities. The hierarchical structure created by this system allowed the SS to manage a large population of inmates with a relatively small number of guards. As the women's camp grew larger, the diversity of the prisoner population became increasingly apparent. Transports brought women from many different regions, including Poland, Germany, France, the Netherlands, Hungary, Slovakia, and other parts of Europe affected by the war. Each group arrived with its own languages, customs, and personal histories, creating a community within the camp that reflected the wide geographic reach of Nazi deportation policies. Despite these differences, the routines imposed by the camp administration placed all prisoners within the same structured environment of roll calls, labor assignments, and barracks life. Work assignments formed another important aspect of the camp's daily operation. Many women were assigned to labor tasks within the Auschwitz complex, including construction work, maintenance duties, and various forms of camp service. Some prisoners were also selected for work details outside the compound, where they performed tasks connected to nearby industrial facilities or agricultural projects associated with the camp system. These assignments were organized by the camp administration and supervised by guards who ensured that prisoners carried out their duties according to the rules of the camp. The expansion of the women's camp therefore occurred alongside the broader development of Auschwitz as a center of forced labor within the Nazi camp network. As months passed, the compound became a densely populated section of Birkenau where thousands of women lived under the same conditions that defined life throughout the camp system. The physical environment of rows of barracks, fences, watchtowers, and assembly grounds formed the setting in which daily life unfolded. At the same time, the administrative structure created by the SS integrated the women's camp into the larger Auschwitz complex, connecting it to the network of labor assignments, transportation routes, and record-keeping systems that govern the camp as a whole. By the end of this period, the women's camp had become firmly established as one of the major sections of Birkenau. Its rapid growth reflected the scale of the deportation system operating across Europe and the central role that Auschwitz had come to play within the concentration camp network during the war. Chapter 3, Segment 1. Administration and guard structure in the women's camp. As the women's camp at Birkenau grew into one of the largest sections of the Auschwitz complex, the SS administration developed a structured system of supervision and control designed to manage the thousands of prisoners who were held within its fences. Like the rest of Auschwitz, the women's camp operated within the broader hierarchy of the Nazi concentration camp system, which was organized under the authority of the SS leadership responsible for managing camps across occupied Europe. At the top of this structure stood the commandant of Auschwitz, whose administrative headquarters were located in the original camp complex known as Auschwitz-I. From this central command, orders were issued that governed the operation of Birkenau and the various subcamps connected to the Auschwitz network. Beneath the commandant, a series of officers and administrative departments were responsible for specific aspects of camp management, including prisoner registration, labor assignments, supply distribution, and security operations. The women's camp formed one part of this administrative structure and was supervised by personnel assigned specifically to oversee the compound where female prisoners were housed. Within the SS system, the supervision of women prisoners involved both male officers and female guards who were trained to enforce the regulations of the concentration camp environment. The female guards, often referred to as Aufseherin, were assigned to monitor the daily activities of prisoners within the women's compound. Their duties included supervising roll calls, overseeing the barracks areas, escorting prisoner work groups, and ensuring that the rules established by the SS administration were followed throughout the camp. These guards worked under the authority of senior SS officers who remained responsible for the overall administration of Birkenau and the Auschwitz complex as a whole. The presence of female guards in the women's camp reflected the administrative policy that female prisoners would often be supervised by women guards during their daily routines. Despite this arrangement, Male SS officers retained ultimate authority over the camp's operations, and they regularly inspected the compound, reviewed administrative reports, and issued orders related to labor assignments or disciplinary measures. Within the compound itself, the internal organization of the women's camp relied not only on the guards but also on a hierarchy of prisoner functionaries appointed by the SS to assist with managing daily routines. These prisoner functionaries were selected from among the inmates and assigned positions that carried specific responsibilities within the camp structure. Some served as block leaders responsible for maintaining order inside individual barracks, while others acted as supervisors within work detachments assigned to labor tasks. The role of these prisoner functionaries was essential to the operation of the camp because they allowed the SS administration to extend its control over a large population without assigning guards to supervise every individual prisoner directly. Prisoner functionaries were expected to organize daily activities within their assigned areas, report problems to the guards, and ensure that prisoners followed the schedules established by the administration. Their positions created a complex hierarchy within the prisoner population, as they were both inmates themselves and representatives of the camp authorities responsible for enforcing discipline. The administrative structure also included offices where records related to the prisoner population were maintained. Every woman who entered the camp was registered in official documents that recorded her identification number, nationality, and other details used by the administration to track individuals within the system. These records were stored in administrative buildings and updated regularly as prisoners were transferred between barracks, assigned to labor details, or moved to other parts of the camp network. The process of maintaining these records formed an essential part of the administrative system that governed Auschwitz. By documenting the movements and assignments of prisoners, the SS administration could manage the large population held within the complex and ensure that labor requirements were met according to the needs of the camp and the industries connected to it. The guard structure within the women's camp was closely tied to the daily routines that defined life in Birkenau. Each day began with roll calls where prisoners assembled in the open areas between barracks while guards counted the population. These counts were compared with the administrative records maintained by the camp offices to confirm that the numbers matched. Once the roll call was completed, prisoners were organized into work detachments and escorted to their assigned labor sites. Guards and prisoner functionaries accompanied these groups to ensure that the prisoners remained within the designated routes and carried out the tasks assigned to them. Throughout the day, guards monitored the compound and the work areas to maintain order and enforce the rules of the camp. At the end of the day, prisoners returned to the compound where another roll call confirmed that all individuals assigned to the barracks were present. Through these procedures, the administrative and guard structure maintained continuous oversight of the prisoner population. The physical layout of the women's camp supported this system of supervision. Fences surrounded the compound, watchtowers allowed guards to observe activity from elevated positions, and the rows of barracks were arranged in a way that allowed clear lines of sight across the camp grounds. Guards patrolled the paths between barracks while prisoner functionaries monitored activities inside the buildings. The result was an environment where the daily movements of prisoners were carefully regulated through a combination of physical barriers, surveillance, and administrative record-keeping. As the population of the women's camp continued to grow, this structure allowed the SS administration to manage thousands of inmates within a controlled environment. The system relied on both formal authority exercised by SS personnel and the internal hierarchy created among prisoners through the appointment of functionaries. Together, these elements formed the administrative framework that governed the women's camp inside Birkenau, shaping the routines and experiences of the women who lived there during the years of the camp's operation. Chapter 3, Segment 2. The Female Guard System and Daily Supervision. As the women's camp in Birkenau expanded during the years of the war, the SS administration relied heavily on a structured system of female guards to supervise the daily activities of the thousands of prisoners who lived within the compound. These guards formed part of the broader concentration camp personnel system organized by the SS, which included both male officers responsible for overall administration and female personnel assigned specifically to oversee women prisoners. The presence of female guards in the women's camp reflected a policy adopted within the concentration camp network in which women inmates were often supervised by women guards during daily routines inside the barracks and work areas. Many of the female guards assigned to Auschwitz had received training at other concentration camps before arriving at Birkenau, particularly at Ravensbrück, which served as the central training location for female personnel within the SS camp system. At Ravensbrück, these guards learned the procedures and regulations associated with camp supervision, including how to enforce discipline, monitor prisoner labor detachments, and maintain order within the barracks compounds. Once assigned to Auschwitz, they became part of the administrative structure that governed the women's camp inside Birkenau. Their responsibilities included overseeing roll calls, supervising prisoners as they moved between barracks and work assignments, and ensuring that the schedules established by the camp authorities were followed throughout the day. The female guards worked under the authority of male SS officers who held senior administrative positions within the Auschwitz complex. These officers issued orders regarding camp procedures, labor assignments, and disciplinary regulations that applied to the prisoner population. While the male SS leadership maintained control over the broader operation of the camp, the female guards carried out much of the direct supervision of women prisoners within the compound itself. Their presence in the barracks areas and assembly grounds meant that prisoners encountered them frequently during daily routines. Each morning when the prisoners assembled for roll call, guards stood nearby to observe the formation of the rows and ensure that the process of counting the population proceeded according to administrative expectations. During these roll calls, prisoner numbers were checked against the official records maintained by the camp offices, confirming that the population within the compound matched the documented totals recorded by the SS administration. After roll call was completed, the guards oversaw the organization of work detachments assigned to various labor tasks either inside the camp or at nearby locations connected to the Auschwitz labor system. Prisoners marched to these work sites under supervision, often escorted by guards who monitored the movement of the groups along the roads and paths that connected different sections of Birkenau. In addition to supervising work assignments, female guards also monitored activities within the barracks areas. The barracks formed the primary living spaces of the women's camp, and maintaining order inside these buildings was considered an important part of the camp administration's responsibilities. Guards conducted inspections of the barracks to ensure that prisoners followed the rules established by the camp authorities regarding cleanliness, organization of sleeping areas, and adherence to daily schedules. These inspections often took place at different times of the day and formed part of the system through which the administration maintained discipline within the compound. Prisoners were expected to respond to instructions issued by guards promptly, and the hierarchical relationship between guards and inmates defined many interactions within the camp environment. The female guards also worked alongside prisoner functionaries appointed by the SS administration to assist with managing daily routines. These functionaries, selected from among the prisoner population, held positions such as block leaders responsible for supervising individual barracks or capos assigned to oversee labor groups. The cooperation between guards and prisoner functionaries formed a system that allowed the SS to extend its control across the large population of women held within the compound. Guards issued instructions and monitored compliance, while prisoner functionaries organized the practical details of daily life inside the barracks and work groups. This structure created a layered hierarchy in which authority flowed from the SS administration through the guards and functionaries to the general prisoner population. The role of female guards in the women's camp was therefore closely connected to the routines that defined life inside Birkenau. From the early morning roll calls to the evening return of prisoners to their barracks after work assignments, guards remained present to enforce the rules established by the camp administration. They observed prisoner movements, monitored work details, and reported incidents to the SS officers responsible for maintaining order across the Auschwitz complex. The physical layout of the camp supported this system of supervision. The rows of barracks were arranged in open compounds where activity could be easily observed, and the watchtowers positioned along the perimeter fences allowed guards to view large sections of the camp from elevated platforms. Roads and paths connecting the different compounds were patrolled regularly, ensuring that prisoners remained within the designated areas assigned to them. Through these combined measures of physical surveillance and administrative oversight, the SS administration maintained control over the women's camp as part of the larger Auschwitz system. For the women who lived within the compound, the presence of guards formed a constant element of the camp environment. Guards appeared during roll calls, accompanied work detachments, inspected barracks, and monitored activities throughout the day. Their role was to enforce the discipline required by the SS administration and ensure that the routines of camp life continued according to the established rules and schedules. Within this structure, the female guard system became one of the key mechanisms through which authority was exercised inside the women's camp at Birkenau, shaping the daily experiences of the prisoners who lived there during the years of the camp's operation. Chapter 3, Segment 3. The prisoner hierarchy inside the women's camp. Within the women's camp at Birkenau, the SS administration relied not only on guards and officers to maintain order, but also on a system of internal hierarchy among the prisoners themselves. This structure formed an important part of how the camp operated on a daily basis, allowing a relatively small number of SS personnel to supervise thousands of inmates across the compound. By appointing certain prisoners to positions of responsibility, the camp authorities created a network of prisoner functionaries who helped enforce rules, organize routines, and assist in the management of the barracks and labor detachments. These functionaries were selected by the SS from among the prisoner population and were given specific duties that placed them in positions of authority over other inmates. One of the most common roles within this system was that of the block leader, a prisoner assigned to supervise a single barrack within the compound. Each barrack in the women's camp held large numbers of prisoners, often far more than the buildings had originally been designed to accommodate. Managing the daily routines of so many people inside a confined space required coordination, and the block leaders were responsible for maintaining order within their assigned buildings. Their duties included ensuring that prisoners followed instructions during roll calls, organizing the arrangement of sleeping areas, and helping distribute food rations when meals were brought into the barracks. Block leaders also reported to the guards about any problems or incidents that occurred inside the building, acting as intermediaries between the SS administration and the general prisoner population. In addition to block leaders, another important position within the prisoner hierarchy was that of the capo, a prisoner who supervised labor detachments assigned to work tasks either inside the camp or at nearby locations connected to the Auschwitz labor system. The capos were responsible for organizing groups of prisoners during work assignments and ensuring that tasks were completed according to the expectations of the camp administration. Because labor detachments often involved large numbers of prisoners working together, the capos served as supervisors who maintained discipline within the group while reporting progress to the guards overseeing the work site. Their authority was derived from the SS administration, which expected them to enforce camp rules and maintain order among the prisoners assigned to their work details. Another category of prisoner functionaries included individuals assigned to administrative or logistical tasks within the camp. Some prisoners worked in kitchens where food rations were prepared for distribution across the compound. Others were assigned to storage areas where supplies such as clothing, tools, or equipment were managed under the supervision of the SS administration. There were also prisoners who assisted in clerical roles, helping maintain records or perform other administrative tasks within offices connected to the camp bureaucracy. These assignments placed certain prisoners in positions where they interacted more directly with camp officials and administrative processes. The existence of this prisoner hierarchy created a complex social structure inside the women's camp. While all prisoners were subject to the authority of the SS administration, those who held functionary roles occupied a different position within the camp's internal system. Their responsibilities often required them to enforce rules that applied to the general prisoner population, which sometimes created tensions between functionaries and other inmates. At the same time, some prisoners in these roles attempted to use their positions to manage daily routines in ways that helped maintain order within the barracks or workgroups. The experience of holding such positions varied widely depending on the individual and the circumstances within the camp. For the SS administration, the system of prisoner functionaries served an important practical purpose. Managing a camp as large as Birkenau with a relatively limited number of guards required a method for extending authority across the prisoner population. By appointing inmates to supervisory roles, the administration created a chain of command that reached into the daily lives of prisoners within the barracks and labor detachments. Guards issued orders and oversaw the overall operation of the compound, while prisoner functionaries implemented those instructions at the level of individual barracks and work groups. This arrangement allowed the camp to operate with a structured routine despite the enormous number of people confined within its fences. The physical environment of the women's camp reinforced this hierarchical structure. Rows of barracks arranged within the fenced compound created separate spaces where block leaders could supervise the prisoners assigned to each building. Assembly grounds used for roll calls allowed guards and prisoner functionaries to organize large groups of inmates into orderly formations. The roads and paths connecting the barracks to work sites provided routes where capos could oversee labor detachments moving under guard supervision. Through this combination of administrative planning and physical layout, the camp authorities established a system where every prisoner existed within a clearly defined chain of authority. The prisoner hierarchy, therefore, became one of the central mechanisms through which the women's camp at Birkenau functioned. It connected the daily routines of the barracks to the broader administrative structure of Auschwitz, ensuring that the instructions issued by SS officers were implemented across the compound. For the thousands of women held within the camp, this hierarchy shaped many aspects of daily life, influencing how work assignments were organized, how barracks routines were maintained, and how communication flowed between prisoners and the camp administration. In this way, the system of prisoner functionaries formed an essential part of the operational structure that allowed the women's camp to function as a controlled section within the vast Auschwitz complex. Chapter 4, Segment 1. Arrival and registration in the women's camp. For the women who arrived at Auschwitz-Birkenau during the years of the war, the first encounter with the camp began with the long railway journeys that carried deportation transports across occupied Europe toward the camp complex located near the town of Auschwitz. These transports often departed from cities, ghettos, or detention centers located far from the camp itself, and the journeys sometimes lasted many hours or even several days depending on the distance traveled. The trains followed routes that connected regional rail networks with the lines leading into Upper Silesia, eventually reaching the area surrounding Birkenau where the camp administration had constructed facilities designed to receive large numbers of prisoners arriving in deportation transports. As the trains approached the camp, prisoners inside the rail cars could sometimes see the surrounding countryside through small openings in the wooden wagons, though they rarely understood exactly where they had been taken until the train slowed and stopped near the campgrounds. When the doors of the wagons were opened, the women who stepped down from the train encountered an environment dominated by the physical structures of Birkenau. Rows of fences, watchtowers, and barracks stretched across the open fields, creating a landscape very different from the towns and communities from which many of them had come. Guards directed the newly arrived prisoners into groups while administrative personnel began the process of organizing the transport according to procedures established by the camp authorities. These procedures formed part of a system designed to manage the continuous arrival of deportees from different regions. The camp administration had developed routines that allowed large numbers of prisoners to be processed quickly upon arrival. The first stage of this process involved assembling the women into lines where guards and administrative personnel could observe the group and begin organizing the next steps. After this initial assembly, the women were directed toward the areas where registration procedures were carried out. Registration formed one of the most important administrative processes within the concentration camp system. Through this procedure, the SS administration recorded the identity of each prisoner entering the camp and assigned a number that would be used to identify that individual within official records. When women entered the registration area, their names, nationalities, and other details were recorded in documents maintained by the camp offices. After these records were completed, each prisoner received an identification number that replaced the use of personal names within the administrative structure of the camp. These numbers were often marked on clothing issued to prisoners and used in all subsequent records related to their assignments, barracks locations, and labor duties. Once registration was complete, the women were directed to areas where their personal belongings were collected and stored. Items that prisoners had brought with them during the journey were taken by the camp administration and placed in storage facilities within the Auschwitz complex. The process of collecting these belongings formed part of the administrative procedures that accompanied the registration of new prisoners. After this stage, the women were guided toward the barracks located within the compound designated as the women's camp. This compound formed one section of the larger Birkenau complex and was surrounded by barbed wire fences and watchtowers similar to those found in other parts of the camp. The barracks where the women were housed were wooden buildings arranged in long rows separated by gravel paths. Inside each barack, wooden bunks stacked in tiers created sleeping areas designed to hold large numbers of prisoners. As the women entered these buildings for the first time, they encountered the crowded conditions that characterized life inside the camp. The bunks were arranged closely together, leaving limited space for movement within the barack interior. Prisoners were assigned places where they would sleep alongside others who had arrived in the same transport or who had been housed in the barack previously. The arrival of new prisoners required the camp administration to integrate them into the daily routines already operating within the compound. Shortly after being assigned to barracks, the women were introduced to the schedule that governed life inside the camp. This schedule included early morning roll calls where prisoners assembled outside the barracks to be counted by guards and administrative personnel. During these roll calls, the number of prisoners present was compared with the records maintained by the camp offices to ensure that the population within the compound matched the official documentation. After roll call, prisoners were assigned to work details that formed part of the forced labor system operating throughout the Auschwitz complex. Some women were assigned to tasks within the camp itself, such as cleaning barracks, assisting in kitchens, or performing maintenance work. Others were organized into labor detachments that left the compound under guard supervision to perform tasks at nearby industrial sites or construction projects. The registration process therefore marked the moment when new arrivals became part of the administrative structure of the camp. Through the assignment of identification numbers, the recording of personal details, and the placement of prisoners within barracks and work groups, the SS administration integrated each individual into the system that governed daily life inside Birkenau. For the women who passed through these procedures, the arrival and registration process formed the beginning of their experience inside the women's camp, where the routines of roll calls, labor assignments, and barracks life would shape their daily existence within the Auschwitz complex. Chapter 4, Segment 2. The first days inside the women's camp. After the process of arrival and registration was completed, the women who had entered Auschwitz-Birkenau found themselves facing the first days of life inside the women's camp, a period that introduced them to the routines, regulations, and environment that would shape their daily existence within the camp system. For many prisoners, this initial period was marked by confusion and uncertainty as they attempted to understand the structure of the camp and the expectations placed upon them by the SS administration. The women had arrived from different parts of Europe and often spoke different languages, which meant that communication among the prisoners themselves could sometimes be difficult during the early days. Despite these challenges, the routines of the camp quickly became clear as the new arrivals were introduced to the strict schedule that governed life within the compound. The barracks assigned to the women served as their primary living spaces. These wooden buildings were arranged in long rows within the fenced area of the women's camp and were designed to hold large numbers of prisoners. Inside each barrack, rows of wooden bunks stacked in tiers created sleeping areas where multiple prisoners shared limited space. During the first days after arrival, the women were directed to these bunks by prisoner functionaries who supervised the internal organization of the barracks. Each prisoner was assigned a place where she would sleep, often alongside others who had arrived in the same transport or who had already been living in the camp before the new arrivals entered the compound. The crowded conditions meant that privacy was extremely limited, and many women had to adjust quickly to living in close proximity with dozens of others within the same building. In addition to the sleeping areas, the barracks contained small spaces where prisoners kept the few personal items that remained in their possession after the registration process. The daily routine inside the camp began early in the morning. Before sunrise, prisoners were required to leave the barracks and assemble outside for the morning roll call conducted by the guards and camp administrators. During this roll call, the women stood in rows while the guards counted the population and compared the numbers with the records maintained in the camp offices. Because the camp held thousands of prisoners, these roll calls could take considerable time to complete. The prisoners remained standing in formation until the count was confirmed and the guards were satisfied that the number of individuals present matched the official records. Once the roll call ended, the prisoners were organized into work detachments according to the labor assignments determined by the camp administration. Labor formed an important part of daily life within the Auschwitz complex, and the women in Birkenau were expected to participate in tasks that supported the operation and expansion of the camp system. Some prisoners were assigned to work details within the women's camp itself. These tasks included cleaning barracks, maintaining the paths and assembly areas, assisting in kitchens where food rations were prepared, or performing other duties necessary to keep the compound functioning. Other prisoners were organized into labor detachments that left the compound under guard supervision and traveled to nearby work sites connected to the Auschwitz labor system. These work sites included construction projects, agricultural areas, and industrial facilities where prisoners performed tasks that contributed to the broader wartime economy controlled by the Nazi administration. For many women, the first days inside the camp were physically demanding as they adjusted to the rhythm of early morning roll calls followed by long hours of labor. At the same time, the limited food rations distributed within the camp created additional challenges for prisoners who were expected to perform work assignments despite the scarcity of nourishment. Food distribution took place at designated times during the day, usually involving small portions that were shared among the prisoners living within each barrack. The distribution process was often supervised by prisoner functionaries responsible for organizing the lines and ensuring that each inmate received a portion according to the camp regulations. After the workday ended, the prisoners returned to the women's camp where another roll call was conducted to verify that all individuals assigned to the compound had returned. Only after this second roll call were the women permitted to re-enter their barracks for the evening hours. Inside the barracks, the prisoners prepared for the next day by arranging their sleeping spaces and resting after the demands of the day's labor. The evenings often included quiet conversations among prisoners who shared information about camp routines, work assignments, or the events they had witnessed since arriving at Birkenau. For new arrivals, these conversations sometimes helped them understand how the camp operated and what to expect in the days ahead. The first days inside the women's camp therefore formed a period of adjustment during which the prisoners became familiar with the environment, the routines, and the rules that defined life inside Birkenau. The schedules of roll calls, labor assignments, and barracks life quickly became part of the daily rhythm of the camp. Within this structure, the women who had recently arrived were gradually integrated into the system that governed the thousands of prisoners living within the compound, marking the beginning of their experience inside one of the most extensive concentration camp complexes established during the war. Chapter 4, Segment 3. Adapting to the camp routine. As the first days in the women's camp passed, the routines of Birkenau gradually became more familiar to the prisoners who had recently arrived, though familiarity did not make the environment easier to endure. The structure of life inside the compound was defined by repetition, schedules, and strict regulations imposed by the camp administration. Every day followed a similar pattern that began before sunrise and continued until late in the evening. For the women living in the barracks, time was measured not by personal schedules or individual plans, but by the signals and commands that marked the beginning and end of each stage of the camp's daily routine. The early morning roll call remained one of the most consistent features of life inside the camp. Prisoners were required to leave their barracks and assemble in rows on the open ground between the buildings where guards and administrative personnel conducted the count of the camp population. These roll calls were not only administrative procedures but also demonstrations of control within the camp environment. Thousands of women stood in formation while the guards verified their presence and compared the results with official records. The process sometimes lasted for long periods of time, especially when the numbers required repeated verification. Regardless of weather conditions, prisoners remained standing until the roll call was completed, and the guards allowed them to proceed to their assigned duties. Once the roll call ended, the prisoners were organized into work detachments according to the assignments determined by the camp administration. The system of forced labor played a central role in the operation of the Auschwitz complex, and the women's camp provided a large workforce for various tasks both inside and outside the compound. Some prisoners worked within the camp itself, performing duties related to maintaining the barracks, cleaning the compound, or assisting with logistical tasks such as distributing food rations and managing supplies. Other prisoners were sent to work sites beyond the women's camp, marching in groups under guard supervision along the roads that connected different sections of Birkenau and the surrounding industrial areas. These work detachments formed part of a broader labor system that linked the camp to construction projects, agricultural operations, and industrial facilities located near Auschwitz. For the women assigned to these detachments, the workday often lasted many hours, and the tasks varied depending on the needs of the camp administration. Construction work was common during the years when Birkenau was still expanding. Prisoners were involved in building new barracks, repairing fences, and maintaining the drainage systems that had been installed to manage the marshy ground on which the camp had been constructed. Other work assignments included sorting clothing and personal belongings taken from arriving transports, assisting in kitchens where food was prepared for distribution, or performing maintenance duties within administrative buildings connected to the camp bureaucracy. Despite the differences between these tasks, all labor assignments were conducted under the supervision of guards and prisoner functionaries who monitored the progress of the work groups. During the hours when prisoners were not working, life inside the barracks was governed by its own set of routines and regulations. The barracks were crowded spaces where many women lived together in close quarters. Wooden bunks arranged in tiers provided sleeping areas, and each prisoner was assigned a place where she rested at night after the day's work had ended. Because the barracks housed large numbers of inmates, maintaining order within these buildings required coordination among the prisoners themselves. Block leaders appointed by the SS administration supervised the internal organization of each barrack, ensuring that prisoners followed the rules established by the camp authorities regarding cleanliness, sleeping arrangements, and preparation for daily roll calls. Food distribution also became part of the daily rhythm of the camp. Meals were delivered to the barracks or distributed at designated points within the compound according to the schedule established by the administration. Prisoners lined up to receive their portions, and the distribution process was usually supervised by prisoner functionaries who organized the lines and reported any irregularities to the guards. Although the rations were limited, the distribution of food formed an essential part of maintaining the daily routines of the camp population. The evenings inside the women's camp were often quieter than the daytime hours, dominated by labor assignments and roll calls. After the final count of the day confirmed that all prisoners had returned from their work details, the women were permitted to enter their barracks for the night. Inside these buildings, prisoners prepared their sleeping spaces and rested after the long hours of the day. Conversations sometimes took place among the women sharing the same bunk areas, where they exchanged information about work assignments, discussed the events of the day, or spoke quietly about the places from which they had come before arriving at the camp. These conversations created moments of human connection within an environment otherwise defined by strict control and routine. Over time, the women who lived in the camp became familiar with the structure that governed their daily lives. The repetition of roll calls, work assignments, food distribution, and barracks routines created a rhythm that shaped the passage of time within the compound. Although the circumstances of life inside Birkenau remained extremely difficult, the prisoners learned how to navigate the schedules and regulations that define the camp environment. In this way, the routines imposed by the SS administration became the framework through which daily life unfolded within the women's camp, influencing how prisoners organized their days and interacted with one another within the confined space of the compound. Chapter 5, Segment 1. Daily life in the women's barracks. Inside the women's camp at Birkenau, daily life revolved around the crowded wooden barracks that served as the central living spaces for thousands of prisoners. These structures formed the physical and social environment where women spent most of their time when they were not assigned to work detachments outside the compound. The barracks were long rectangular buildings constructed from wood, arranged in rows across the fenced section of Birkenau designated for female prisoners. Gravel paths ran between the rows of buildings, connecting them to the assembly grounds where roll calls were conducted and to the roads leading toward other areas of the camp. From the outside, the barracks appeared almost identical to one another, creating a repetitive landscape that stretched across the compound. Each building had a simple design with small windows and a doorway that opened into the interior space where the prisoners lived. Inside the barracks, the most noticeable feature was the arrangement of wooden bunks stacked in tiers. These bunks were built in long rows along the interior walls, leaving narrow aisles between them where prisoners could move through the building. Each tier contained flat wooden platforms that served as sleeping spaces, and multiple prisoners were assigned to each section. Because the number of prisoners held in the women's camp increased rapidly as new transports arrived, the bunks often became crowded with several women sharing a space originally intended for fewer occupants. The limited space meant that prisoners slept closely together, adjusting their positions within the bunk areas to accommodate everyone assigned to the building. The bunks formed the center of life inside the barracks, serving as places where prisoners rested during the night and where they sometimes sat during the brief periods when they were allowed to remain indoors between work assignments and roll calls. The interior of the barracks contained very little furniture beyond the bunk structures themselves. A few benches or simple tables might be placed in certain areas, but most of the space was devoted to sleeping arrangements designed to house the large population of inmates. Along the interior walls or near the bunks, prisoners sometimes kept small personal items that remained in their possession after the arrival process. These items were limited, and the storage space available inside the barracks was minimal. As a result, many prisoners carried their belongings with them or kept them tucked within the bedding materials assigned to their bunk area. Lighting inside the barracks was often dim, especially during the early morning and evening hours when natural light from the small windows was limited. The buildings were not designed for comfort but rather for accommodating large numbers of prisoners within a confined space. Despite these conditions, the barracks became the primary setting where women formed relationships, exchanged information, and created small routines that helped them navigate the structure of camp life. The organization of each barrack was supervised by prisoner functionaries appointed by the SS administration. Among these functionaries were block leaders who were responsible for maintaining order inside the building and ensuring that the prisoners assigned to the barrack followed the camp's regulations. The block leaders organized the sleeping arrangements, helped coordinate the distribution of food rations delivered to the building, and ensured that prisoners were prepared for roll calls and work assignments according to the schedule established by the camp authorities. These responsibilities placed the block leaders in positions where they interacted frequently with both the guards and the prisoners living within the barracks. Their role formed part of the internal hierarchy through which the camp administration maintained control over the large population of inmates. Daily life inside the barracks was closely connected to the larger routine of the camp. Each morning, prisoners left the building before sunrise to assemble outside for roll call. During these assemblies, guards counted the population and compared the numbers with administrative records to confirm that all prisoners assigned to the compound were present. Once the roll call was completed, the prisoners marched to their work assignments under the supervision of guards and prisoner functionaries. The barracks then remained largely empty during the daytime hours while most prisoners were engaged in labor tasks either inside the camp or at nearby work sites. Later in the day, after the work detachments returned and the evening roll call had been conducted, the prisoners re-entered their barracks for the night. These evening hours were often the only time when the women could remain inside the building for an extended period. During this time, they prepared their sleeping spaces, shared quiet conversations with those nearby, and attempted to rest before the next day's schedule began again. Conversations inside the barracks sometimes allowed prisoners to exchange information about events occurring in other parts of the camp or about the backgrounds of the individuals who shared the same living space. Women came from many different regions of Europe, and the barracks therefore became places where languages and cultural traditions from different communities were present side by side. Some prisoners helped translate conversations between women who spoke different languages, allowing communication to take place despite the diversity of the camp population. These interactions created small networks of familiarity within the larger structure of the camp, though the overall environment remained defined by the strict routines imposed by the SS administration. The barracks were also places where prisoners experienced the seasonal changes of the environment surrounding Birkenau. During winter months, the cold temperatures affected the interior spaces of the wooden buildings, while during warmer seasons the air inside the barracks could become heavy and crowded due to the number of people living within them. These conditions were part of the physical reality of life inside the camp, shaping how prisoners experienced the environment throughout the year. Despite the difficulties associated with these living conditions, the barracks remained the central setting of daily life in the women's camp. They were the spaces where prisoners rested, interacted with one another, and prepared themselves for the routines of roll calls and labor that defined each day. In this way, the wooden barracks of Birkenau formed not only the physical structures of the women's camp, but also the social spaces where the experiences of thousands of female prisoners unfolded during their time within the Auschwitz complex. Chapter 5, Segment 2. Food, Survival, and the Daily Struggle for Strength. Food inside the women's camp at Birkenau formed one of the most central elements of daily life, shaping not only the physical condition of the prisoners, but also the rhythm of each day within the compound. The distribution of food followed a strict schedule determined by the camp administration, and prisoners quickly learned to organize their routines around the moments when meals were issued. These meals were limited in quantity and simple in composition, reflecting the broader structure of rationing that defined the concentration camp system. For the women who lived inside the barracks of Birkenau, food became more than just a necessity for survival. It was also a daily event that influenced conversations, routines, and relationships among prisoners who shared the same living space. The day often began before sunrise with the morning roll call, and after this assembly some prisoners received a small ration that served as the first meal of the day. This morning portion was usually modest and designed to provide minimal nourishment before prisoners were sent to their work assignments. The distribution process was organized by prisoner functionaries who supervised the lines and ensured that the rations were divided according to the rules established by the camp authorities. Prisoners stood in rows waiting to receive their portion, and the orderly distribution of these rations formed an important part of maintaining the daily routine of the camp. After receiving the morning ration, the women were assigned to work detachments and left the barracks area under guard supervision. During the hours spent working in construction projects, maintenance tasks, or other labor assignments connected to the Auschwitz complex, the limited food provided earlier in the day was often the only nourishment available until the next distribution period. Because many work assignments required physical effort, the relationship between food and labor became a central reality of life within the camp. Prisoners depended on the small portions distributed by the administration while continuing to perform tasks assigned to them as part of the forced labor system. The next food distribution often occurred later in the day, typically after prisoners returned from their work assignments and assembled again for the evening roll call. Once the population count had been confirmed, food was brought into the barracks area where it was distributed among the prisoners living within each building. The organization of this process again relied heavily on prisoner functionaries who supervised the lines and ensured that the rations were divided among the women assigned to that barrack. Because the number of prisoners inside each barrack could be large, the distribution required coordination to ensure that every person received a portion. Prisoners waited patiently as the rations were passed along, often gathering in small groups while the distribution continued throughout the building. Inside the barracks, these meal times became moments when the women could briefly focus on something other than the demands of the daily work schedule. Conversations sometimes took place among prisoners sharing the same bunk areas as they ate their rations. Women from different regions of Europe shared stories about their homes, families, or experiences before arriving at the camp. In these moments, the act of sharing food or discussing the distribution sometimes created small connections between prisoners who might otherwise have remained strangers within the crowded environment of the barracks. Because the women's camp included prisoners from many different cultural and linguistic backgrounds, these interactions often involved a mixture of languages and gestures as the women attempted to communicate with one another. Food also influenced the internal routines of the barracks in practical ways. Prisoners sometimes organized their small belongings around the times when meals were distributed, and the preparation for receiving rations became part of the daily schedule that governed life inside the building. Block leaders responsible for supervising each barrack often ensured that prisoners were present when food arrived and that the lines formed in an orderly manner. This organization helped the distribution proceed efficiently and prevented confusion among the large number of inmates living within the barracks. The relationship between food and survival also shaped how prisoners thought about the future. For many women, the daily distribution of rations represented one of the few predictable events in the otherwise uncertain environment of the camp. Knowing that food would be distributed at certain times allowed prisoners to measure the passage of the day and anticipate the next stage of the routine. Even though the portions were limited, the regularity of the distribution created a structure within the daily rhythm of the camp that prisoners could rely upon. In addition to the main distributions, some prisoners assigned to kitchen duties or storage areas played roles in preparing or transporting the food used in the camp. These assignments involved organizing supplies, moving containers of rations between buildings, and assisting in the preparation of meals before they were distributed across the compound. Although these tasks were part of the broader labor system of the camp, they also connected certain prisoners more directly to the process through which food reached the barracks. Through this system of preparation and distribution, the camp administration maintained the routine that governed how prisoners received their daily rations. Despite the limitations of the food supply, the shared experience of waiting for and receiving meals formed one of the defining aspects of daily life inside the women's camp. Each distribution marked a moment in the day when prisoners gathered together within the barracks or the surrounding paths, temporarily shifting their attention from work assignments and administrative routines to the simple act of eating. Over time, these moments became woven into the structure of life within the camp, shaping how prisoners experienced the passage of each day and how they interacted with the women who shared the same living space inside the wooden barracks of Birkenau. Chapter 5, Segment 3: Community, Communication, and Human Connection. Inside the women's camp at Birkenau, daily life unfolded within a structured system imposed by the camp administration. Yet within that rigid framework, the prisoners themselves formed small networks of communication and community that shaped their experiences in subtle but meaningful ways. The barracks were not only places where women slept and waited between work assignments. They were also the primary spaces where prisoners interacted with one another, exchanged information, and gradually developed forms of social connection within the crowded environment of the camp. Because the women who lived in Birkenau came from many different regions of Europe, the community inside the barracks reflected a wide range of languages, cultures, and personal histories. Women from Poland, Germany, France, the Netherlands, Slovakia, Hungary, and other areas found themselves sharing the same wooden structures and sleeping spaces despite having grown up in entirely different social environments. This diversity created challenges for communication, especially in the early days after new transports arrived, when prisoners often struggled to understand one another's languages. Over time, however, many women found ways to bridge these differences. Some prisoners spoke multiple languages and acted as informal translators within the barracks, helping others communicate basic information about daily routines, work assignments, or instructions issued by guards. Through these interactions, the women gradually developed informal networks of support that allowed them to navigate the complex structure of the camp environment together. Communication among prisoners often took place quietly during the brief periods when they were inside the barracks in the evenings or during moments of rest between daily duties. Women sitting on the wooden bunks or standing in the narrow aisles between them shared stories about the places from which they had come, the families they had left behind, and the events that had led to their deportation. These conversations created a sense of continuity between the prisoners' lives before the camp and the reality they now faced within Birkenau. In many cases, these exchanges also helped prisoners learn more about the camp itself. Women who had arrived earlier sometimes explained the routines of roll calls, the structure of work assignments, or the organization of the camp's internal hierarchy to those who were newly arrived. This transfer of knowledge allowed newcomers to understand the system more quickly and adjust to the expectations placed upon them by the administration. Within the crowded space of the barracks, prisoners also formed small groups based on shared language, nationality, or simply the fact that they had been assigned to neighboring bunks. These groups sometimes provided emotional support during difficult moments, offering companionship in an environment where personal privacy and individual independence were extremely limited. The shared experience of living within the camp created bonds between women who might otherwise never have met in their previous lives. Even simple acts such as helping another prisoner understand instructions or sharing information about work assignments could strengthen these connections. Because the daily routine of the camp was demanding and often exhausting, the moments when prisoners could speak with one another became important opportunities for maintaining a sense of human interaction within the structured environment of the compound. Communication inside the women's camp also played a role in spreading news and information throughout the prisoner population. News about events occurring in other parts of the camp sometimes reached the barracks through conversations between prisoners who had been assigned to different work details. Women returning from labor assignments outside the compound might describe what they had seen during the day, including the activities taking place in other sections of Birkenau or the arrival of new transports at the camp. These exchanges allowed prisoners to piece together a broader understanding of the environment around them, even though their own movements were restricted to specific areas of the camp. In this way, The informal networks of communication among prisoners functioned as a means of sharing knowledge and maintaining awareness of the larger system in which they were living. The physical environment of the barracks influenced how these interactions took place. The narrow aisles between bunks meant that conversations were often conducted quietly and in close proximity to others. At times, several groups might be speaking simultaneously within the same building, creating a low murmur of voices that reflected the presence of many different languages and accents. Despite the crowded conditions, these conversations allowed prisoners to maintain a degree of social interaction that stood in contrast to the strict routines imposed by the camp administration. The evenings inside the barracks often became the primary time when such communication occurred, as prisoners prepared their sleeping spaces and rested after the long hours of the workday. During these hours, women sometimes shared memories of their homes, their families, and the lives they had known before arriving at Birkenau. For some prisoners, these memories provided a sense of continuity and identity that remained separate from the numbered records used by the camp administration to classify them. The ability to speak about one's past or to listen to another prisoner's story created moments of reflection within the otherwise regimented structure of camp life. These interactions also reinforced the sense that, despite the harsh conditions of the camp environment, the women living within the barracks continued to form connections with one another as individuals rather than existing solely as numbers within the administrative system. Over time, these networks of communication and community became an integral part of daily life in the women's camp. They helped prisoners navigate the routines of roll calls, labor assignments, and barracks organization, while also providing moments of human connection within the structured environment of Birkenau. Although the camp administration maintained strict control over the compound, the social interactions that developed among the prisoners themselves demonstrated how individuals continued to seek connection and understanding even within the highly regulated world of the concentration camp system. Chapter 6, Segment 1. Forced labor and the role of women in the camp economy. Within the structure of Auschwitz-Birkenau, forced labor formed one of the central mechanisms through which the camp operated, and the women imprisoned inside the Birkenau women's camp became an essential part of this system as the camp expanded during the war years. The camp was not only a place of imprisonment but also a complex network of labor detachments connected to construction projects, agricultural work, and nearby industrial facilities that relied on prisoner labor to sustain their operations. For the women who lived inside the compound, work assignments quickly became a defining element of daily life, shaping the rhythm of their days and determining where they would spend most of their time outside the barracks. After the morning roll call had been completed and the guards confirmed the count of prisoners, the women were organized into groups according to the labor assignments determined by the camp administration. These groups, known as work detachments, assembled in designated areas of the compound before marching out under guard supervision toward the sites where they would perform their assigned tasks. Some of these assignments took place within the camp itself. In these cases, the women remained inside the fenced area of Birkenau and carried out duties that supported the functioning of the camp infrastructure. Such tasks included cleaning barracks, maintaining paths and drainage channels, assisting in kitchen areas where food was prepared, or working in storage facilities where supplies were sorted and distributed across different sections of the camp. Other prisoners were assigned to labor details that required them to leave the immediate compound of the women's camp and travel to nearby locations connected to the broader Auschwitz complex. These work detachments marched along roads that linked Birkenau with industrial sites and construction areas in the surrounding region. Guards accompanied the groups throughout the journey, ensuring that prisoners remained together and followed the routes assigned to them. Upon arrival at their work sites, the prisoners performed a variety of tasks depending on the needs of the projects being carried out by the camp administration and the companies cooperating with the SS authorities. Construction work was among the most common assignments during the early years of Birkenau's expansion. Women prisoners were often involved in transporting building materials, assisting with the construction of new barracks, and maintaining the infrastructure that allowed the camp to continue growing as more prisoners arrived. The landscape of Birkenau itself required ongoing work because the camp had been built on marshy ground that needed drainage systems and road improvements to remain functional. Prisoners assigned to these tasks worked in teams under the supervision of guards and prisoner functionaries responsible for organizing the labor detachments. The workday often lasted many hours, with only brief pauses permitted during the schedule established by the camp authorities. In addition to construction projects, many women were assigned to labor connected with the industrial operations associated with the Auschwitz complex. Nearby factories and workshops relied on prisoner labor to perform tasks such as sorting materials, assembling components, or assisting with production processes that supported the wartime economy of Nazi Germany. The transportation networks linking the camp to industrial areas allowed the administration to move prisoner labor detachments to these facilities regularly. For the women assigned to these tasks, the daily march between the camp and the work site became part of the routine that structured their days. Prisoners walked in groups under guard supervision, leaving the camp in the morning after roll call and returning in the evening when the workday had ended. The organization of these labor detachments required careful coordination by the camp administration. Lists of prisoners assigned to each work detail were maintained by administrative offices, ensuring that the number of prisoners present at the work site matched the official records. Prisoner functionaries played an important role in managing these groups. Kapos, who were prisoners appointed by the SS to supervise work detachments, helped organize the labor process and reported progress or issues to the guards overseeing the assignment. This hierarchical structure allowed the SS administration to manage large numbers of prisoners while maintaining control over the work being performed. Within this system, every prisoner was integrated into the broader economic structure that connected the camp to external projects and industries. The return from work assignments marked another stage in the daily routine of the women's camp. In the late afternoon or early evening, the labor detachments marched back toward Birkenau, often following the same routes used earlier in the day. Upon arrival at the camp gates, the prisoners assembled once again for roll call so that guards could verify that the number of individuals returning matched the number who had left earlier in the morning. Only after this count was confirmed were the women allowed to re-enter the compound and return to their barracks for the evening hours. These repeated cycles of roll call, labor assignments, and return to the barracks formed the foundation of daily life within the women's camp. Over time, the routine of forced labor became deeply integrated into the structure of the camp environment. The women living in Birkenau were expected to participate in this system regardless of the specific tasks assigned to them. The combination of construction projects, industrial labor, and internal camp duties created a network of work assignments that connected the women's camp to nearly every aspect of the Auschwitz complex. Through these assignments, the prisoners became part of the broader economic system that the SS administration had built around the camp, demonstrating how forced labor served as one of the key functions of Auschwitz during the years of its operation. Chapter 6, Segment 2. Work details inside the camp. Within the vast structure of Birkenau, not every woman imprisoned in the camp was sent to external work sites each day. A significant number of prisoners were assigned to labor details that took place entirely inside the camp itself, forming a complex internal workforce responsible for maintaining the daily operation of the compound. These assignments were organized by the camp administration and distributed through lists maintained in the administrative offices of Auschwitz. After the morning roll call confirmed the population of the women's camp, guards and prisoner functionaries directed the inmates toward their designated work groups. Some of these groups remained within the fenced boundaries of the women's compound, while others moved to nearby sections of Birkenau where various logistical and maintenance activities were carried out. The work performed inside the camp was essential for sustaining the large population held there. Because Birkenau had been constructed to hold tens of thousands of prisoners, the infrastructure of the camp required constant maintenance. Roads had to be kept clear, barracks cleaned, storage areas organized, and supplies transported between different sections of the camp. Women assigned to internal labor detachments participated in these tasks under the supervision of guards and prisoner functionaries who managed the workflow within each group. One of the most common internal assignments involved maintaining the barracks themselves. The barracks were crowded wooden structures where large numbers of prisoners lived, and keeping these buildings functional required continuous cleaning and organization. Women assigned to this work detail swept the floors, arranged bunks, and ensured that the narrow aisles between sleeping areas remained clear. Because new transports arrived regularly, the number of prisoners inside each barrack could change frequently, requiring adjustments to sleeping arrangements and storage spaces. Prisoner functionaries supervised these activities, coordinating the work and ensuring that the barracks remained organized according to the regulations imposed by the camp administration. Another group of prisoners worked in the kitchens that prepared food for the camp population. The kitchens formed an important logistical center where rations were distributed to different sections of Birkenau. Women assigned to kitchen duties participated in tasks such as transporting food containers, organizing utensils, and assisting with the preparation and distribution of meals. Although the rations provided to prisoners were limited, the process of preparing and delivering these meals required coordination among the workers assigned to the kitchens and those responsible for distributing food within each barack. The kitchen work details therefore became an integral part of the daily operation of the camp, linking the preparation of food to the system of distribution that reached thousands of prisoners each day. In addition to kitchen work, some women were assigned to storage facilities where supplies were sorted and managed. These facilities contained clothing, tools, and various materials used throughout the camp. The organization of these supplies was handled by prisoner work groups who sorted items according to instructions given by the camp administration. These tasks required attention to detail, as the supplies were distributed to different sections of Birkenau depending on the needs of each compound. Women working in these storage areas spent long hours handling materials under the supervision of guards, who ensured that the assigned tasks were completed according to the established procedures. Another internal labor assignment involved the maintenance of the campgrounds. Birkenau covered a large area of land that included roads, drainage channels, and open spaces between barracks. Women assigned to these maintenance details worked outdoors, clearing paths, repairing sections of fencing, and assisting with the upkeep of the infrastructure that allowed the camp to function. The marshy nature of the land on which Birkenau had been built required ongoing work to maintain drainage systems and keep the roads usable throughout the year. These maintenance tasks often involved groups of prisoners working together to transport materials or repair sections of the camp environment under the supervision of guards. The organization of these internal work groups relied heavily on prisoner functionaries known as capos, who were responsible for supervising the labor detachments and reporting their progress to the SS personnel overseeing the work. The capos coordinated the movements of the prisoners within each group, ensuring that tasks were carried out according to the instructions issued by the camp administration. This hierarchical system allowed a relatively small number of guards to supervise a large workforce spread across the different sections of Birkenau. For the women assigned to these internal work details, the daily routine often followed a predictable pattern. After roll call in the early morning, the prisoners marched or walked to the areas of the camp where their labor assignments were located. Throughout the day, they performed their tasks within the boundaries of the camp while guards and prisoner functionaries monitored their activities. Short pauses sometimes occurred during the workday, but the overall schedule remained structured by the camp administration's expectations regarding productivity and discipline. When the workday ended, the prisoners returned to the women's compound in time for the evening roll call, where the guards once again verified the number of individuals present before allowing them to return to their barracks. Through these internal labor assignments, the women imprisoned at Birkenau contributed directly to the functioning of the camp itself. Their work supported the infrastructure that allowed the camp to operate, from maintaining barracks and kitchens to managing supplies and keeping the campgrounds in working order. While the tasks varied depending on the needs of the administration, each assignment formed part of the broader system through which the camp sustained its daily routines and managed the large population of prisoners living within its fences. Chapter 6, Segment 3. External Labor and the Wider Camp System. Beyond the internal work details carried out within the fences of the women's compound, many prisoners in Birkenau were regularly assigned to labor detachments that operated outside the immediate boundaries of the camp. These external work assignments formed a crucial part of the broader system surrounding Auschwitz, connecting the concentration camp to nearby construction projects, agricultural estates, and industrial facilities that relied heavily on forced labor during the war years. For the women who were assigned to these detachments, daily life involved not only the routines inside the camp, but also the journeys beyond its gates as they were marched to work sites located throughout the surrounding region. Each morning after the roll call had been completed and the camp administration had confirmed the prisoner count, groups of women assembled in formation according to the labor lists maintained by the administrative offices. Guards and prisoner functionaries organized these groups into columns before leading them toward the gates of Birkenau. The march from the camp to the work sites became a familiar part of the daily rhythm for many prisoners. These marches often followed roads connecting Birkenau to nearby villages, industrial complexes, and agricultural areas where labor was required. The groups walked under the supervision of guards who accompanied them along the route, ensuring that the prisoners remained together and followed the instructions issued by the camp authorities. The distance traveled varied depending on the location of the work assignment. Some detachments worked relatively close to the camp, while others marched longer distances to reach their designated sites. For the women assigned to these external labor details, the journey itself formed an important part of the day's routine, marking the transition from the controlled environment of the camp compound to the wider landscape surrounding Auschwitz. Many of the external labor assignments were connected to the construction and maintenance of infrastructure that supported both the camp system and the wartime economy of Nazi Germany. Construction projects in the region often relied on prisoner labor to complete tasks such as transporting materials, preparing foundations, or assisting with the building of roads and facilities. Women assigned to these projects worked in teams under the supervision of guards and prisoner functionaries who coordinated the activities of the labor detachments. The work required physical effort and was carried out according to schedules established by the camp administration in cooperation with the organizations overseeing the construction sites. In addition to construction work, some prisoners were assigned to agricultural labor in the fields surrounding the camp. These agricultural estates were used to produce food supplies that supported the camp system and nearby communities connected to the German administration. Women working in these agricultural detachments performed tasks such as planting, harvesting, and maintaining the fields under the direction of supervisors responsible for the agricultural operations. The seasonal nature of farming meant that the type of work changed throughout the year, and prisoners assigned to these tasks often worked outdoors in varying weather conditions depending on the time of year. Another significant category of external labor involved industrial facilities located in the region around Auschwitz. Factories producing materials for the German war effort relied on the labor of prisoners to maintain production levels during the later years of the war. Women assigned to these industrial work details traveled from the camp to the factories where they performed tasks related to manufacturing or sorting materials used in production processes. The industrial sites were often located within reachable distance of the camp, allowing the administration to organize daily labor detachments that moved between Birkenau and the factory grounds. Within these facilities, prisoners worked under supervision while guards monitored the detachments and ensured that the work continued according to the schedules established by the authorities overseeing the operations. The organization of these external labor assignments required coordination between the camp administration and the various projects or facilities that relied on prisoner labor. Lists of prisoners assigned to each detachment were maintained by administrative offices, ensuring that the number of individuals leaving the camp in the morning matched the number returning in the evening. Prisoner functionaries played an important role in supervising the work groups during the day, reporting progress and maintaining order within the detachments while the guards oversaw the overall operation. This layered structure allowed the SS administration to manage a large workforce spread across multiple locations outside the camp. At the end of the workday, the detachments assembled once again for the return march to Birkenau. The journey back often took place in the late afternoon or early evening, with prisoners walking in formation along the same routes they had followed earlier in the day. Upon arriving at the camp gates, the groups assembled for the evening roll call where the guards verified that all prisoners assigned to the labor detachments had returned. This final count confirmed the administrative records before the women were allowed to re-enter the compound and return to their barracks. Through this system of external labor detachments, the women imprisoned in Birkenau became part of a wider network of work that extended far beyond the fences of the camp itself. Their daily routines connected the internal structure of the women's camp with the surrounding industrial, agricultural, and construction activities that depended on forced labor during the war years. In this way, the external work assignments carried out by prisoners demonstrated how the camp functioned not only as a place of detention, but also as a central component of a broader labor system integrated into the economic structures of the region surrounding Auschwitz. Chapter 7, Segment 1. Punishment and Discipline in the Women's Camp. Inside the women's camp at Birkenau, the structure of daily life was reinforced by a strict system of discipline imposed by the SS administration. This system was designed to maintain order within the large prisoner population and to ensure that the routines of the camp continued according to the regulations established by the authorities. The administration viewed discipline as an essential element of camp management, and the rules governing prisoner behavior were communicated through a combination of written regulations, verbal instructions issued by guards, and the expectations enforced by prisoner functionaries responsible for maintaining order within the barracks and labor detachments. From the moment prisoners arrived at the camp, they were introduced to a highly regulated environment in which every aspect of daily life was controlled through schedules, commands, and procedures that defined how prisoners were expected to behave within the compound. The most visible expression of this discipline appeared during the daily roll calls that took place each morning and evening. These assemblies were not only administrative counts of the prisoner population but also demonstrations of the authority exercised by the camp administration. Prisoners were required to stand in rows according to the instructions of guards and prisoner functionaries, while the population was counted and verified against the official records maintained in the camp offices. During these roll calls, prisoners were expected to remain in formation and follow all instructions without hesitation. The strict organization of these assemblies reflected the broader emphasis placed on order and control throughout the camp system. If irregularities occurred during the counting process, such as discrepancies between the number of prisoners present and the numbers recorded in administrative documents, the roll call could be repeated until the issue was resolved. Because the population of the women's camp included thousands of individuals, maintaining accurate records required careful coordination between guards, administrative personnel, and prisoner functionaries who helped organize the formations during these assemblies. The system of discipline extended beyond roll calls into nearly every aspect of daily life within the compound. Prisoners were required to follow specific schedules for leaving the barracks, assembling for work assignments, and returning to the compound after the workday ended. Guards and prisoner functionaries monitored these movements to ensure that prisoners remained within the designated areas and followed the instructions issued by the camp administration. The structure of work detachments also formed part of the disciplinary system. When prisoners were assigned to labor groups, they were expected to perform the tasks given to them under the supervision of guards and capos who oversaw the detachments. Maintaining order within these groups was considered essential for the functioning of the labor system that supported the camp's operations and the external projects connected to it. Within the barracks themselves, Prisoner functionaries known as block leaders played an important role in maintaining discipline among the inmates assigned to each building. These individuals were responsible for ensuring that prisoners followed the internal regulations governing barracks life. Their duties included organizing the sleeping arrangements within the bunks, preparing prisoners for roll calls, and overseeing the distribution of food rations delivered to the building. Because the barracks housed large numbers of prisoners, maintaining order within these spaces required coordination and supervision that extended throughout the day. Block leaders communicated with guards about the condition of the barracks and any issues that arose among the prisoners living there. This system created a layered structure of authority in which prisoner functionaries acted as intermediaries between the SS administration and the general prisoner population. Discipline within the camp also involved various forms of corrective measures applied when prisoners were considered to have violated camp regulations. These measures were determined by the SS personnel responsible for maintaining order and could involve different administrative responses depending on the circumstances of the situation. The purpose of these measures was to reinforce the authority of the camp administration and to ensure that the rules governing prisoner behavior were followed. In addition to these formal disciplinary procedures, the presence of guards and the structured environment of the camp itself served as constant reminders of the expectations placed upon prisoners. Watchtowers positioned along the perimeter fences allowed guards to observe activity throughout the compound, while patrols moved along the paths between barracks and work areas. The physical layout of the camp therefore supported the system of discipline by creating an environment where prisoner movements could be monitored and regulated at all times. The roads connecting the barracks, assembly grounds, and work areas formed clear routes that prisoners followed during their daily routines, further reinforcing the structured nature of life within the camp. For the women living in Birkenau, the system of discipline shaped nearly every moment of their daily existence. From the early morning roll calls to the organization of work detachments and the routines within the barracks, the camp administration maintained a consistent emphasis on order and control. These procedures ensured that the camp continued functioning according to the rules established by the SS authorities, integrating the women's camp into the broader administrative and labor systems that defined the operation of Auschwitz during the years of its existence. Chapter 7, Segment 2. The Structure of Authority and Control. Within the women's camp at Birkenau, authority operated through a layered structure designed to maintain control over thousands of prisoners living within the fenced compound. The SS administration relied on a combination of physical surveillance, administrative organization, and internal prisoner hierarchies to regulate daily life and ensure that the camp's routines continued according to the established system. This structure of authority extended across every aspect of the camp environment, shaping how prisoners moved through the compound, how work assignments were organized, and how communication between prisoners and guards took place. At the top of the system were the SS officers responsible for overseeing the Auschwitz complex as a whole. These officers operated from administrative headquarters located within the main camp and maintained authority over Birkenau and the various subcamps connected to the larger network. Orders issued by these officials determined the regulations governing prisoner behavior, the distribution of labor assignments, and the procedures used to maintain administrative records for the camp population. Beneath the senior officers were guards and administrative personnel assigned to specific sections of the camp, including the women's compound within Birkenau. Female guards were responsible for supervising the daily routines of the women prisoners, particularly during roll calls, movements between barracks and work details, and the organization of the compound's internal spaces. These guards operated under the instructions of the SS officers and served as the most visible representatives of camp authority for the prisoners living inside the compound. Their presence was constant throughout the day, as they monitored the activities of prisoners during roll calls, accompanied labor detachments leaving the camp for work assignments, and conducted inspections of the barracks where prisoners slept. The guards were supported by the physical design of the camp itself. Birkenau had been constructed as a controlled environment with fences, watchtowers, and clearly defined paths connecting the different sections of the camp. Electrified barbed wire fences surrounded the compound, creating boundaries that prisoners were not permitted to approach. Watchtowers positioned along these fences allowed guards to observe large portions of the camp from elevated platforms, providing a clear view of the barracks, assembly grounds, and roads where prisoners moved during the day. This system of surveillance ensured that the movements of the prisoner population remained visible to the authorities at nearly all times. The layout of the camp therefore reinforced the administrative structure by making it easier for guards to monitor activity and maintain order within the compound. Another important element of authority inside the women's camp was the system of prisoner functionaries. These individuals were prisoners selected by the SS administration to carry out supervisory roles within the internal organization of the camp. Among them were block leaders responsible for managing the barracks where prisoners lived. Block leaders organized sleeping arrangements, supervised the preparation of prisoners for roll calls, and ensured that the routines within each building followed the regulations set by the administration. They also communicated with guards about issues within the barracks and relayed instructions from the SS authorities to the prisoners living under their supervision. In addition to block leaders, capos were appointed to oversee work detachments assigned to labor tasks, either inside the camp or at nearby work sites. Capos organized groups of prisoners during work assignments, ensuring that tasks were carried out according to the instructions given by the camp administration and the guards supervising the labor details. The presence of these prisoner functionaries created an internal hierarchy among the inmates, establishing levels of responsibility that extended the authority of the SS administration throughout the camp population. Because the number of guards assigned to the women's camp was relatively small compared with the number of prisoners held within the compound, this hierarchical system allowed the administration to manage the camp more effectively. Prisoner functionaries served as intermediaries who helped enforce the regulations governing daily life while reporting to the guards responsible for maintaining discipline within the camp. The daily routines of roll calls, labor assignments, and barracks organization provided the framework through which this system of authority operated. Each morning the prisoners assembled for roll call, forming rows while guards and prisoner functionaries counted the population and compared the numbers with the administrative records maintained by the camp offices. Once the count was confirmed, the prisoners were organized into work detachments and marched to their assignments under guard supervision. During these movements, the hierarchical structure remained visible as guards issued instructions. Capos directed the work groups, and prisoners followed the established order of the formation. At the end of the workday, the detachments returned to the camp where another roll call verified that all prisoners had returned before they were allowed to enter the barracks for the evening. Through these repeated procedures, the system of authority maintained continuous control over the prisoner population. The presence of guards, the surveillance provided by watchtowers, and the organization of prisoner functionaries all worked together to reinforce the structure imposed by the SS administration. For the women living in Birkenau, this structure shaped every aspect of daily life, from the way they assembled during roll calls to the organization of work groups and the routines followed inside the barracks. The system of authority and control therefore formed the foundation upon which the operation of the women's camp depended, integrating the prisoners into the broader administrative framework that governed the entire Auschwitz complex. Chapter 7, Segment 3. The psychological weight of the camp system. Beyond the physical routines of labor, roll calls, and barracks life, the structure of the women's camp at Birkenau also created a powerful psychological environment that shaped the experiences of the prisoners who lived within it. The camp was designed not only as a physical space of confinement, but also as a highly controlled system where order, surveillance, and repetition influenced how prisoners perceived time, authority, and their place within the larger structure of Auschwitz. For the women imprisoned there, daily life unfolded within an environment where every movement was regulated, and where the routines imposed by the administration defined the rhythm of each day. The repetition of these routines played a significant role in shaping the mental landscape of the camp. Each morning began with the same process of leaving the barracks before sunrise and assembling information for roll call. The prisoners stood together while guards counted the rows and confirmed the numbers recorded in the administrative records. After the count was completed, the women marched to their work assignments, returned later in the day for the evening roll call, and then re-entered the barracks to prepare for the next day's schedule. Because this cycle repeated day after day, the passage of time within the camp often became measured not by calendars or personal milestones but by the sequence of these recurring events. The structure of the camp, therefore, created a sense of routine that replaced many of the familiar patterns of life the prisoners had known before their arrival. The physical layout of Birkenau reinforced this psychological structure. Rows of barracks arranged across the compound, fenced boundaries, watchtowers, and clearly defined paths created an environment where space itself reflected the organization imposed by the camp authorities. The repetitive appearance of the barracks, each nearly identical to the others, contributed to the sense that the camp existed as a carefully planned system rather than a collection of separate buildings. Prisoners moving through the compound each day saw the same rows of wooden structures, the same fences stretching across the horizon, and the same watchtowers standing along the perimeter. Over time, these visual elements became familiar landmarks within the confined world of the camp. Yet they also served as reminders that the prisoners lived within a space designed to control movement and maintain order at all times. Communication among prisoners provided one of the few ways in which individuals could navigate this psychological environment. Conversations inside the barracks allowed women to exchange information about the routines of the camp, the locations of different work assignments, and the experiences of other prisoners who had been living in Birkenau longer. For new arrivals, these conversations sometimes helped clarify aspects of camp life that were difficult to understand during the first days inside the compound. Women who had already spent time in the camp explained how roll calls were conducted, how work groups were organized, and how the administrative structure functioned within the compound. In this way, informal networks of communication helped prisoners interpret the system surrounding them. The diversity of the prisoner population meant that these conversations often involved multiple languages and cultural backgrounds. Women from Poland, Germany, France, Hungary, Slovakia, and other regions shared the same barracks, bringing different perspectives and experiences into the camp environment. Some prisoners who spoke more than one language helped translate conversations between groups, allowing information to circulate more easily throughout the compound. These interactions created small communities within the barracks, where women who shared similar languages or experiences formed informal groups that provided companionship during the brief periods when they were able to speak freely with one another. These moments of communication offered a contrast to the otherwise structured routines imposed by the administration. The psychological experience of living within the camp was also shaped by the constant presence of authority figures and the visible systems of surveillance that surrounded the compound. Guards patrolled the paths between barracks, watchtowers overlooked the camp from elevated platforms, and prisoner functionaries supervised activities within the barracks and work detachments. The knowledge that movements and actions were continuously observed reinforced the sense that the camp existed as a controlled environment where the administration maintained authority over every aspect of daily life. For prisoners, this awareness influenced how they moved through the compound and interacted with others, as they navigated the rules and expectations established by the camp authorities. Despite the rigid structure of the camp system, the women imprisoned in Birkenau continued to find ways to preserve elements of personal identity within the routines of daily life. Conversations about family members, memories of home, and stories from life before the camp allowed prisoners to maintain a connection with the past, even as they lived within the confines of the compound. These exchanges often took place quietly inside the barracks during the evening hours, when the day's work had ended and prisoners prepared their sleeping spaces for the night. Within these moments of reflection and communication, women were able to share experiences that reminded them of their lives beyond the camp environment. In this way, the psychological landscape of the women's camp at Birkenau was shaped by both the structure imposed by the administration and the human interactions that continued among the prisoners themselves. The routines of roll calls, labor assignments, and barracks life created a framework that defined daily existence, while the conversations and relationships formed among prisoners allowed individuals to navigate that framework in ways that preserved a sense of connection and identity. Through these overlapping experiences, the women living in the camp encountered not only the physical realities of the concentration camp system, but also the psychological challenges of existing within a world governed by constant surveillance, rigid schedules, and the authority of the camp administration. Chapter 8, Segment 1. Health, Illness, and the Camp Infirmary. Within the women's camp at Birkenau, the question of health became an unavoidable part of daily life, shaped by the crowded living conditions, demanding work schedules, and the limited resources available within the camp system. The barracks where the prisoners lived were often filled far beyond their intended capacity, and the close proximity of so many people in a confined space created an environment where illness could spread quickly. At the same time, the daily routine of forced labor and the limited food rations distributed by the camp administration placed constant physical strain on the prisoners. As a result, maintaining health under such circumstances was extremely difficult, and many women experienced periods of illness or exhaustion during their time in the camp. To address medical needs within the prisoner population, the camp administration established infirmary barracks where individuals who were unable to continue working could be placed for treatment or observation. These infirmary areas formed part of the broader camp infrastructure and were managed through a combination of SS oversight and prisoner staff assigned to medical duties. Some prisoners who had medical training before their imprisonment were assigned to work within these infirmaries, assisting with basic care for those who were ill. Their responsibilities included monitoring the condition of patients, organizing sleeping areas within the infirmary barracks, and communicating with the administrative personnel responsible for maintaining records of the prisoners receiving treatment. The infirmary buildings themselves were similar in structure to the other barracks within the camp, constructed from wood and arranged in rows along the paths connecting different sections of Birkenau. Inside these buildings, bunks were arranged to accommodate prisoners who were temporarily unable to participate in daily work assignments. The environment inside the infirmary differed somewhat from the regular barracks in that the prisoners placed there were excused from labor while they remained under observation. However, the overall conditions remained closely tied to the limitations of the camp system, including the restricted availability of medical supplies and the large number of individuals requiring care at any given time. Prisoners assigned to the infirmary were usually transferred there after being identified during daily routines such as roll calls or work assignments when it became clear that they were unable to continue their tasks due to illness or exhaustion. Once admitted to the infirmary, their names and identification numbers were recorded in administrative documents that tracked their presence within the camp system. These records allowed the camp authorities to monitor which prisoners were temporarily absent from labor assignments due to health reasons. Because forced labor was an essential component of the camp's operation, the administration maintained close attention to the number of prisoners who were available for work and those who were not. For the women placed in the infirmary, the experience of being removed from the daily work routine created a different rhythm of life compared with the barracks where most prisoners lived. Instead of leaving the building each morning for labor assignments, the patients remained inside while medical staff and prisoner assistants monitored their condition. The days in the infirmary often passed more quietly than those in the general barracks, though the building still operated within the overall structure of the camp's administrative system. Guards and administrative personnel visited the infirmary to inspect the records and ensure that the procedures followed their aligned with the regulations established by the camp authorities. At the same time, The presence of the infirmary reflected the broader reality that the camp population included individuals whose physical condition fluctuated over time due to the demanding environment in which they lived. Illness within the camp could take many forms, ranging from fatigue caused by long hours of labor to conditions related to the crowded living spaces inside the barracks. The limited availability of medical supplies and the large number of prisoners meant that the infirmary often operated under challenging circumstances as staff attempted to care for those in need. Prisoners assigned to medical roles did what they could within these constraints, using their previous training and experience to assist fellow inmates. Their work represented one of the few areas within the camp where professional knowledge from life before imprisonment could be applied within the structure of the camp system. Even with the presence of infirmary facilities, the overall conditions of life within the women's camp continued to influence the health of the prisoner population. After leaving the infirmary and returning to the barracks, prisoners resumed the daily routines of roll calls, labor assignments, and life within the crowded wooden buildings. These routines shaped the environment in which the women lived, making the maintenance of physical health an ongoing challenge within the broader structure of Birkenau. In this way, the infirmary served both as a place where illness was addressed and as a reminder of the physical demands imposed by life inside the concentration camp system. Chapter 8, Segment 2. Hygiene, Sanitation, and Living Conditions. Inside the women's camp at Birkenau, the conditions of hygiene and sanitation formed an important part of daily life and greatly influenced the health and well-being of the prisoner population. The camp had been constructed rapidly as the number of deportations increased during the war, and the infrastructure designed to support thousands of inmates struggled to keep pace with the expanding population. As more women arrived in transports from different parts of Europe, the barracks within the compound became increasingly crowded. This overcrowding created challenges for maintaining cleanliness and proper sanitation within the living spaces where prisoners spent their evenings and nights after returning from labor assignments. The wooden barracks themselves had been designed as basic structures intended to house large numbers of people. Inside each building, rows of bunks arranged in tiers provided sleeping areas for dozens of prisoners. Because the number of inmates assigned to each barrack often exceeded the original design capacity, several women frequently shared the same bunk area. This close proximity meant that personal space was extremely limited, and maintaining hygienic conditions within the sleeping areas required constant effort. Prisoner functionaries responsible for managing each barrack organized cleaning routines designed to keep the floors and aisles clear of debris and to maintain a level of order within the crowded environment. Women assigned to these internal work details swept the floors, arranged bedding materials, and ensured that the narrow pathways between bunks remained accessible for movement within the building. Outside the barracks, the camp administration had established sanitation facilities intended to serve the prisoner population. These facilities included latrine areas located at specific points within the compound where prisoners could go at designated times according to the camp schedule. Because the women's camp held thousands of inmates, the use of these facilities required careful organization. Prisoners often waited in lines during the limited periods when access was permitted, and prisoner functionaries supervised the process to ensure that the routines followed the regulations imposed by the camp authorities. The sanitation areas were an essential part of maintaining basic hygiene within the compound, though the high number of prisoners using them created challenges for keeping the facilities in working condition. In addition to the latrines, washing areas were provided where prisoners could attempt to clean themselves and their clothing. These washing facilities were simple and often relied on water supplied through communal basins or taps located within the compound. Access to these areas was limited by both time and the availability of resources, and prisoners had to organize their use of the facilities according to the schedules allowed by the camp administration. Despite these limitations, many women attempted to maintain personal hygiene whenever possible, understanding that cleanliness could play an important role in preserving health within the crowded environment of the camp. Washing clothes and maintaining basic cleanliness became part of the informal routines that prisoners developed alongside the official schedules imposed by the authorities. The environment surrounding the barracks also influenced sanitation conditions within the camp. Birkenau had been built on land that had previously been marshy farmland, and although drainage systems had been installed during construction, the ground could still become muddy during periods of rain or snow. This meant that prisoners moving between barracks, assembly grounds, and work areas often walked across paths that became difficult to keep clean. Women assigned to maintenance details spent time clearing these paths and repairing drainage channels in an effort to keep the compound functional throughout the changing seasons. The work carried out by these maintenance groups played an important role in managing the environmental conditions that affected sanitation within the camp. Hygiene inside the barracks also depended on the cooperation of the prisoners living within each building. Block leaders supervised routines intended to maintain order, instructing inmates to arrange bedding materials and keep their sleeping areas organized. Because the barracks housed women from many different regions and backgrounds, the shared responsibility of maintaining cleanliness often required coordination and communication among prisoners who spoke different languages. Some women helped translate instructions issued by the block leaders, allowing the routines to be carried out more effectively despite the linguistic diversity of the population. These small acts of cooperation demonstrated how prisoners adapted to the structured environment of the camp while attempting to maintain the living spaces they shared. Even with these efforts, the overall conditions of sanitation in the women's camp remained closely tied to the broader limitations of the camp system. The large number of prisoners, the crowded barracks, and the restricted access to hygiene facilities created an environment where maintaining cleanliness required constant work. For the women living inside the compound, the routines of cleaning barracks, waiting in line at sanitation facilities, and attempting to wash clothing or personal items became part of the daily rhythm of life in Birkenau. These activities, though often overlooked in official administrative records, played an essential role in shaping the everyday experiences of the prisoners who navigated the challenges of hygiene and sanitation within the women's camp. Chapter 8, Segment 3. Weather, Seasons, and the Physical Environment of Birkenau. The physical environment of Birkenau played a constant role in shaping the daily experiences of the women imprisoned inside the camp, and the changing seasons of the year influenced nearly every aspect of life within the compound. The camp had been constructed on open land near the village of Brzezinka, where wide fields stretched across the surrounding countryside. Before the war, this area had consisted largely of farmland and marshy ground, and when the SS administration selected the site for the expansion of Auschwitz, large sections of the land were cleared and reorganized to make space for the rows of barracks and the infrastructure required for the new camp complex. Despite the drainage channels that were installed during construction, the natural characteristics of the landscape continued to affect the conditions inside Birkenau throughout the years of its operation. During periods of rain, the ground between the barracks could become muddy, and prisoners moving through the compound often walked along paths where the soil softened underfoot. In winter, the same landscape was transformed by snow and freezing temperatures that covered the rows of buildings and the open spaces between them. The women who lived in the camp experienced these seasonal changes directly because much of their daily routine took place outdoors. Each morning, prisoners left their barracks before sunrise and assembled on the open grounds of the compound for roll call, where they stood in rows while guards counted the population. These assemblies occurred regardless of weather conditions, meaning that the prisoners experienced the cold of winter mornings as well as the rain and wind that sometimes swept across the fields surrounding Birkenau. In summer, the open ground between the barracks could become dry and dusty, particularly after long periods without rain. When work detachments marched through the compound toward the gates of the camp, the movement of hundreds of prisoners along the gravel paths stirred dust into the air. The heat of the summer months affected both the work assignments and the conditions inside the barracks where prisoners rested at night. The wooden buildings absorbed warmth during the day, and the crowded sleeping spaces could become uncomfortable during hot weather. Prisoners often opened the small windows in the barracks whenever possible to allow air to circulate through the interior spaces. Although these windows were limited in size, they provided some connection to the outside environment and allowed the prisoners to observe the changing landscape beyond the immediate walls of the building. During winter, the challenges created by the environment took on a different form. Snow covered the roofs of the barracks and the fields surrounding the camp, while cold winds moved across the open ground. The prisoners continued to follow the same routines of roll calls and labor assignments during these months, walking along paths that sometimes became icy or difficult to navigate. The barracks offered some shelter from the cold during the evening hours, but the wooden structures were not designed to provide strong insulation against winter temperatures. Prisoners often arranged their bedding materials carefully and shared sleeping spaces within the bunks in an effort to remain warm during the night. These adjustments became part of the informal routines developed by prisoners living within the barracks as they adapted to the seasonal conditions of the camp environment. The surrounding countryside remained visible from many parts of Birkenau, and prisoners sometimes saw distant fields, tree lines, or farm structures beyond the fences that enclosed the compound. Although movement outside the camp was strictly controlled and prisoners could not approach the perimeter fences, the sight of the broader landscape served as a reminder that the camp existed within a larger rural setting. For women who had come from cities or towns located far away from this region, the open fields surrounding Birkenau represented a landscape very different from the places where they had previously lived. Yet the fences and watchtowers of the camp created a boundary that separated the prisoners from that environment, reinforcing the sense that the compound formed a distinct world within the wider countryside. Seasonal changes also influenced the work assignments carried out by prisoners both inside and outside the camp. Construction projects, maintenance of drainage systems, and agricultural labor in nearby fields often followed patterns determined by the time of year. During warmer months, groups of prisoners might work outdoors on building projects or agricultural tasks, while winter conditions sometimes shifted the focus of work details toward maintenance or other duties that could be performed despite the cold weather. Regardless of the season, however, the structure of the workday remained largely unchanged. Prisoners marched to their assignments in the morning and returned to the compound in the evening, passing through the same gates and along the same roads that connected the camp to its surrounding areas. The environment of Birkenau therefore formed a constant backdrop to the routines of camp life. The weather, the changing seasons, and the characteristics of the landscape influenced how prisoners experienced each day within the compound. While the administrative structure of the camp determined the schedules and regulations governing daily activities, the natural environment shaped the physical conditions under which those routines were carried out. From the muddy ground of rainy days to the frozen mornings of winter roll calls, the women living inside the camp encountered the realities of the surrounding landscape as an inseparable part of their lives within Birkenau. Chapter 9, Segment 1. Resistance, Adaptation, and Quiet Acts of Survival. Within the women's camp at Birkenau, life unfolded under strict control, with daily routines organized through roll calls, labor assignments, and the regulations enforced by guards and prisoner functionaries. Yet even inside such a structured environment, the prisoners developed ways of adapting to the conditions around them and supporting one another through quiet acts that helped them navigate the system of the camp. These actions rarely resembled open rebellion or dramatic resistance. Instead, they often took the form of small decisions, shared knowledge, and cooperation between prisoners who lived together in the crowded barracks of the women's compound. Because the camp administration controlled nearly every visible aspect of daily life, survival within this environment often depended on understanding the routines of the camp and learning how to move within those routines as effectively as possible. Women who had spent longer periods inside Birkenau frequently became important sources of information for new arrivals. When transports of prisoners entered the camp and the women were assigned to the barracks for the first time, Those who had already lived within the compound explained how daily schedules worked, where to stand during roll calls, how work detachments were organized, and what the various signals or commands from guards meant. These conversations helped new prisoners adjust more quickly to the environment they had entered, reducing confusion during the early days when the structure of the camp was still unfamiliar. In this way, the sharing of knowledge became one of the most important forms of quiet support among the women living in the barracks. Communication within the camp often crossed linguistic and cultural boundaries. The population of the women's camp included prisoners from many different regions of Europe, and languages spoken within the barracks ranged from Polish and German to French, Hungarian, Slovak, Dutch, and others. Because of this diversity, some prisoners who spoke multiple languages naturally became intermediaries who helped translate conversations or instructions between different groups. These individuals played an informal but important role in the daily life of the camp by helping prisoners understand the regulations and routines imposed by the administration. Through this exchange of information, the women were able to build small networks of communication that extended beyond individual barracks and connected prisoners assigned to different work detachments. Cooperation also appeared in practical ways during daily routines. In the crowded sleeping areas inside the barracks, prisoners often helped one another organize bedding spaces or adjust the arrangement of bunks so that everyone assigned to the building could find a place to rest. During food distributions, women sometimes assisted those who were unfamiliar with the process of lining up or receiving rations. In some cases, prisoners who worked in kitchens or storage areas used their positions to pass along information about food distribution schedules or supply deliveries, helping others understand when and where rations would be distributed. These small acts did not challenge the authority of the camp administration directly, but they allowed prisoners to navigate the daily system with greater awareness and coordination. Another form of adaptation involved the way prisoners organized themselves within the work detachments assigned to labor tasks. When groups marched out of the camp in the morning under guard supervision, prisoners sometimes formed informal partnerships with others working in the same group. These partnerships allowed them to share information about the tasks assigned during the workday and to assist one another when learning unfamiliar duties. Because work assignments could vary depending on the project or location, having a partner who could explain the routine or demonstrate the required task made it easier for new prisoners to adjust to the demands of the labor system. Over time, these partnerships sometimes developed into friendships that continued inside the barracks during the evening hours when prisoners returned from work. Communication inside the barracks also played a role in preserving memories of life before imprisonment. In quiet conversations during the evenings, women shared stories about their homes, their families, and the communities from which they had come before being deported to Auschwitz. These conversations allowed prisoners to maintain a connection to their personal histories, reminding one another that their identities extended beyond the numbers assigned to them by the camp administration. In an environment where official records replaced personal names with identification numbers, the act of telling one's story or listening to another's experience became a way of preserving individuality within the structured system of the camp. At times, prisoners also found ways to support one another through small gestures of assistance during daily routines. Women who had been assigned to work details within the camp sometimes helped others understand how to perform tasks more efficiently or shared practical advice about managing the long hours of labor. Those who had experience in medical professions before their imprisonment occasionally assisted fellow prisoners who were feeling ill, offering guidance about seeking treatment in the camp infirmary or helping them navigate the procedures required for admission to the medical barracks. These acts of support were not organized as formal systems but developed naturally through the relationships formed among prisoners living and working together in the camp environment. The presence of these small networks of cooperation did not remove the hardships of life inside Birkenau, but they provided a means through which prisoners could adapt to the routines imposed by the administration. Within the rigid framework of roll calls, labor assignments, and barracks life, The women created spaces of communication and assistance that helped them navigate the complex structure of the camp. Through shared knowledge, quiet conversations, and practical cooperation, the prisoners demonstrated that even within an environment defined by strict control, human connection and mutual support remained possible. Chapter 9, Segment 2. The Underground Exchange of Information. Within the tightly controlled structure of the women's camp at Birkenau, the movement of information became an important part of how prisoners understood the environment around them. Although the camp administration regulated nearly every visible aspect of daily life, communication among prisoners created informal networks through which news, observations, and practical knowledge circulated inside the compound. These exchanges rarely occurred openly or in organized ways. Instead, they developed gradually through conversations inside the barracks, brief discussions during work assignments, and quiet moments when prisoners shared what they had seen or heard during the day. Because the population of the women's camp was constantly changing as new transports arrived and others were transferred to different sections of the Auschwitz complex, the circulation of information helped prisoners form a broader understanding of the camp system that extended beyond their immediate surroundings. For many women, the first sources of information about the camp came from prisoners who had already spent time in Birkenau before the arrival of new transports. These women often explained the basic structure of the camp environment to those who had just arrived. They described the purpose of roll calls, the way work detachments were organized, and the internal hierarchy that included guards, prisoner functionaries, and the administrative offices responsible for maintaining records of the camp population. Such explanations helped newcomers navigate the complex system of rules and routines that govern daily life within the compound. Without these informal conversations, many prisoners would have had difficulty understanding the expectations placed upon them during their first days in the camp. Information also traveled between prisoners who were assigned to different labor detachments. Because some work groups remained inside the camp while others traveled to nearby construction sites, agricultural areas, or industrial facilities, the women returning from these assignments often brought back observations about what they had seen during the workday. These conversations allowed prisoners to learn about parts of the Auschwitz complex that they might never see themselves. For example, women working in maintenance details inside the camp might hear descriptions of external work sites from prisoners assigned to labor outside the compound. In this way, the exchange of information helped create a shared awareness of the broader system surrounding Birkenau. The diversity of languages spoken within the women's camp influenced how information spread through the prisoner population. Women from many different countries were imprisoned together, and communication often required the assistance of those who spoke more than one language. These individuals became important intermediaries who translated conversations and helped relay information between groups of prisoners who might otherwise have been unable to understand one another. Over time, this informal translation network allowed news and observations to circulate across the camp despite the linguistic diversity of the population. Prisoners who possessed language skills therefore played a significant role in maintaining communication within the barracks and work detachments. The physical environment of the barracks also shaped how these exchanges occurred. In the evenings, after prisoners returned from work assignments and completed the final roll call of the day, the interior spaces of the barracks became one of the few places where extended conversations could take place. Women sitting on the wooden bunks or standing in the narrow aisles between them often spoke quietly with those nearby, sharing details about the day's events or discussing the routines of the camp. These conversations sometimes spread gradually across the building as information passed from one group of prisoners to another. Although the barracks were crowded and closely supervised, these evening hours allowed a limited space for communication that was not always possible during the structured routines of the workday. Information exchange also played a role in helping prisoners anticipate changes within the camp. When new transports arrived at Birkenau, the presence of unfamiliar prisoners moving through the compound often became a topic of discussion among those already living there. Observations about the size of incoming groups or the countries from which the women had been deported were sometimes shared inside the barracks, contributing to a collective understanding of the camp's continuing expansion. Similarly, when prisoners were transferred between barracks or assigned to different work details, the changes in routine often prompted conversations about the administrative decisions shaping the organization of the camp population. In this way, the movement of prisoners within the compound created opportunities for information to circulate through the informal communication networks that developed among inmates. While these exchanges did not alter the fundamental structure of the camp system, they provided prisoners with a means of interpreting the environment around them. Through conversations with fellow inmates, women learned which work assignments might be easier or more demanding, how the administrative routines functioned, and what to expect during different stages of camp life. This knowledge allowed prisoners to approach daily routines with greater awareness and sometimes helped them adjust their behavior within the structured framework imposed by the camp authorities. Over time, the sharing of information became part of the social fabric of the women's camp. It connected prisoners across different barracks and work detachments, creating a network of communication that extended throughout the compound. Although the administration maintained strict control over the official flow of information within the camp, the conversations among prisoners demonstrated how individuals continued to seek understanding and connection within the environment of Birkenau. Through these quiet exchanges, the women living inside the camp constructed a shared awareness of the system that surrounded them, reinforcing the role of communication as an important element of daily life within the women's camp at Auschwitz-Birkenau. Chapter 9, Segment 3. Quiet Forms of Solidarity Among Prisoners. Inside the women's camp at Birkenau, the routines of roll calls, labor assignments, and barracks life created a structured environment where the daily movements of prisoners were regulated by the administration. Yet within this controlled system, the prisoners themselves developed subtle forms of solidarity that allowed them to support one another during the challenges of camp life. These forms of cooperation rarely appeared as organized resistance or open defiance. Instead, they existed in small, often quiet actions that helped prisoners navigate the difficult conditions of the camp while maintaining connections with the people around them. Because thousands of women from different parts of Europe were confined together in the same compound, these acts of solidarity developed gradually through shared experiences inside the barracks and during the long hours spent working in labor detachments. The crowded wooden barracks where prisoners slept and rested after the workday became one of the primary spaces where these relationships formed. Women assigned to neighboring bunks often began to speak with one another during the evening hours when the day's routines had ended. At first, these conversations were simple exchanges about where each person had come from or how long she had been in the camp. Over time, however, these interactions sometimes grew into small groups of prisoners who looked after one another within the structure of the barracks. They might remind one another of the time for morning roll call, help arrange sleeping spaces when new prisoners arrived, or share practical information about the routines of the camp. Because many prisoners had been separated from family members or communities during deportation, these small groups sometimes provided a sense of companionship in an environment where personal connections had been disrupted. Solidarity also appeared during the daily work assignments carried out by labor detachments. Prisoners working together on construction projects, maintenance tasks, or industrial duties often spent long hours in the same group under guard supervision. Within these groups, women sometimes developed informal partnerships with others assigned to the same tasks. These partnerships helped prisoners manage the work more effectively by sharing knowledge about how the tasks were performed or by offering encouragement during long hours of labor. Because work assignments could change from time to time, prisoners who had previous experience with a particular task sometimes explained the routine to those who were performing it for the first time. In this way, knowledge passed between prisoners within the work groups, helping individuals adjust more quickly to the demands of new assignments. Language differences within the camp also created opportunities for solidarity among prisoners. The women's camp included individuals who spoke many different languages, and communication between groups often depended on prisoners who were able to translate conversations or instructions. Women who spoke more than one language frequently acted as informal intermediaries, helping others understand announcements from guards or instructions given during work assignments. These translations were particularly important for newly arrived prisoners who might otherwise struggle to understand the routines of the camp during their first days inside the compound. By assisting with communication, these multilingual prisoners helped reduce confusion and allowed information to move more easily through the diverse population of the camp. Another form of solidarity emerged in the sharing of personal experiences and memories. During the quiet hours inside the barracks, prisoners sometimes spoke about their homes, their families, and the lives they had lived before arriving at Birkenau. These conversations created moments where women could reconnect with their personal histories and listen to the stories of others who had been deported from different regions of Europe. Through these exchanges, prisoners learned about the cultures and traditions of the communities from which their fellow inmates had come. Although the camp administration had replaced personal names with identification numbers in official records, the act of telling one's story allowed individuals to maintain a sense of identity beyond the administrative structure of the camp. Listening to another prisoner's experiences also created bonds of empathy and understanding that strengthened the relationships forming within the barracks. Acts of solidarity sometimes appeared in practical gestures as well. Women who worked in internal camp assignments such as kitchens or storage areas occasionally shared information about food distribution schedules or changes in daily routines that others might not yet know. Prisoners assigned to maintenance details sometimes warned fellow inmates about difficult tasks ahead or offered advice about how to complete work assignments more efficiently. These small acts of assistance helped individuals adapt to the camp environment and reduced some of the uncertainty that surrounded daily life in Birkenau. Because the camp administration relied on strict routines to maintain order, understanding those routines became an important part of navigating the system successfully. The sharing of such knowledge, therefore, represented a quiet but meaningful form of cooperation among prisoners. Even within the hierarchical structure created by the appointment of prisoner functionaries, moments of solidarity could occur. Some prisoners who held supervisory roles within the barracks or labor detachments attempted to balance their administrative responsibilities with gestures of assistance toward fellow inmates. While the roles of block leaders or capos placed these individuals in positions of authority within the prisoner population, their interactions with other prisoners sometimes reflected the same sense of shared experience that existed among the general camp population. The relationships that developed inside the women's camp, therefore, took many forms, ranging from simple conversations to practical cooperation during daily routines. These forms of solidarity did not change the structure of the camp system itself, which remained firmly controlled by the SS administration. However, they demonstrated how prisoners continued to seek connection and mutual support even within the restrictive environment of Birkenau. Through shared knowledge, translation of languages, partnerships during labor assignments, and the telling of personal stories, the women imprisoned in the camp created small networks of solidarity that helped them navigate the complex and demanding world of the women's camp at Auschwitz-Birkenau. Chapter 10, Segment 1. The final phase of the women's camp. As the war in Europe entered its final stages in 1944 and early 1945, the atmosphere within Auschwitz-Birkenau, including the women's camp inside the Birkenau complex, began to change in noticeable ways. The camp had already existed for several years, and during that time it had expanded into one of the largest concentration camp complexes established by Nazi Germany. The women's camp, which had begun as a newly organized compound intended to house female prisoners transported from other camps and occupied territories, had grown into a vast section of Birkenau containing thousands of inmates. By the final phase of the war, the compound had developed its own routines, internal hierarchies, and labor systems that connected it to the broader operations of Auschwitz. Yet, as the military situation on the Eastern Front shifted and the German authorities began to confront the possibility of advancing Allied forces reaching the region, signs of change appeared within the camp administration and the daily life of prisoners. One of the most visible changes during this period involved the growing movement of prisoners between different sections of the camp system. Transports that had once arrived regularly at Birkenau from across occupied Europe became less predictable as the war disrupted transportation networks and altered the priorities of the Nazi administration. At the same time, the camp authorities began reorganizing prisoner populations within the complex, transferring groups of inmates to other camps or labor sites located further west. These transfers were often connected to the broader strategy of maintaining the forced labor system that had become a central feature of the concentration camp network. Women from Birkenau were sometimes included in these movements, leaving the compound in groups escorted by guards as they were reassigned to other locations within the camp system. For those who remained in the women's camp, daily life continued to follow the familiar structure of roll calls, labor assignments, and evenings inside the crowded barracks. The physical environment of Birkenau remained largely unchanged during this period. Rows of wooden barracks stretched across the compound, surrounded by the fences and watchtowers that defined the boundaries of the camp. Prisoners assembled for roll calls each morning and evening, while guards confirmed the population numbers recorded in administrative records. Work detachments continued to leave the compound under guard supervision, marching toward the construction projects, industrial facilities, and maintenance tasks that still required labor within the Auschwitz complex and the surrounding region. Yet even as these routines persisted, many prisoners sensed that the larger context surrounding the camp was shifting. News about developments on the front lines of the war occasionally reached the prisoners through conversations with fellow inmates or observations made during work assignments outside the immediate boundaries of the camp. Some women heard rumors about advancing armies or changes in the control of territories across Eastern Europe. These fragments of information were often incomplete and sometimes contradictory, but they contributed to a growing awareness among prisoners that the war was approaching a turning point. Inside the barracks, prisoners discussed these rumors quietly during the evening hours, attempting to interpret what the changes might mean for the future of the camp and the people held within it. The administration of Auschwitz also began to take measures reflecting the changing military situation. As the possibility of enemy forces approaching the region became more realistic, the SS authorities initiated plans to relocate prisoners from certain camps toward areas further west under German control. These movements were part of a broader effort by the Nazi administration to prevent large numbers of prisoners from being liberated by advancing armies. Within the women's camp, these developments created uncertainty as prisoners observed increased activity related to administrative planning and transportation. Groups of inmates were assembled for transfers, and the lists maintained by the camp offices were updated to reflect these changes in the prisoner population. For many women living in Birkenau during this period, the uncertainty surrounding these transfers added another layer of complexity to the routines that had already defined life within the camp. Despite these developments, the daily structure of camp life remained firmly in place for much of this final phase. Prisoners continued to wake before sunrise, assemble for roll call, march to work assignments, and return to the barracks at the end of the day. The familiar rhythm of these routines created a sense of continuity even as the larger situation surrounding the camp evolved. Women who had spent months or years within the compound understood the patterns of the camp's daily schedule and followed them with the same discipline that had been required since their arrival. At the same time, conversations within the barracks often reflected the awareness that events beyond the fences of Birkenau were beginning to influence the future of the camp itself. In this final phase of the women's camp at Auschwitz-Birkenau, the familiar structures of daily life continued to operate within an environment shaped by uncertainty and change. The routines that had governed the camp for years remained visible in the roll calls, labor assignments, and crowded barracks where prisoners lived. Yet the shifting conditions of the war gradually began to alter the context in which these routines existed, setting the stage for the events that would eventually bring the long history of the camp toward its conclusion. Chapter 10, Segment 2. Evacuations and the Movement of Prisoners. During the final months of the war, the situation surrounding Auschwitz-Birkenau changed rapidly as the German administration began preparing for the possibility that advancing Allied forces would reach the region. These developments had a direct impact on the women's camp inside Birkenau, where thousands of prisoners had been living within the established routines of the camp system. As military conditions on the Eastern Front continued to shift, the SS authorities initiated plans to move large groups of prisoners away from camps located closer to the approaching front lines and toward camps further west that remained under German control. This process of relocation, often referred to as evacuation by the camp administration, involved organizing prisoners into transports or marching columns that would leave the Auschwitz complex and travel toward other locations within the concentration camp network. For the women imprisoned in Birkenau, these changes introduced a new layer of uncertainty into daily life. Throughout the previous years of the camp's operation, prisoners had become accustomed to the repetitive routines of roll calls, labor assignments, and evenings inside the barracks. Although life inside the camp had been structured and tightly controlled, the physical environment of the compound had remained relatively stable. Now, however, the increasing movement of prisoners and administrative activity within the camp suggested that significant changes were underway. Lists of prisoners were reviewed and updated by the camp offices as the administration prepared to organize groups for transfer. Guards and administrative personnel moved between the barracks and offices as they coordinated the logistics of transporting large numbers of prisoners out of the complex. For prisoners observing these developments, the growing administrative activity indicated that the situation beyond the fences of Birkenau was beginning to influence events inside the camp. The process of evacuation required careful organization because the camp population included thousands of prisoners from different sections of the Auschwitz complex. Groups were assembled according to lists prepared by the camp administration, and prisoners were instructed to prepare for departure under guard supervision. In many cases, these evacuations took the form of long marches away from the camp, with columns of prisoners escorted by guards along roads leading westward toward other camps within the concentration camp system. These movements often began during the cold winter months of early 1945, when the region surrounding Auschwitz experienced low temperatures and difficult weather conditions. Prisoners leaving the camp carried only the limited belongings they possessed within the barracks, and the marches often continued for long distances as the columns moved away from the advancing front lines. For the women who were included in these evacuations, the departure from Birkenau marked the end of their time inside the compound that had defined their daily lives. The barracks where they had lived, the assembly grounds where roll calls had been conducted, and the paths they had walked each day to work assignments were left behind as the columns moved along the roads outside the camp. Many prisoners had spent months or even years within the fences of Birkenau, and leaving the camp created a moment of transition from the familiar environment of the compound to an uncertain journey toward other destinations within the camp system. Guards supervised these movements closely, ensuring that the prisoners remained within the columns and followed the routes assigned by the administration. Not all prisoners left Birkenau at the same time, and the evacuation process occurred in stages as different groups were assembled and transported away from the camp. Some prisoners were placed on trains that carried them to other concentration camps further west, while others traveled entirely on foot as part of marching columns organized by the SS authorities. These movements reflected the broader strategy of the Nazi administration to maintain control over the prisoner population while relocating them away from areas that might soon be reached by enemy forces. For those prisoners who remained in Birkenau during this period, the evacuations created noticeable changes within the camp environment. Barracks that had once been crowded with prisoners sometimes became quieter as groups departed, and the number of inmates present during roll calls began to decrease as the population of the camp shifted. At the same time, administrative activity continued as the SS authorities prepared additional transports and reviewed the records used to track the prisoner population. The changing atmosphere within the compound reflected the fact that the long-established routines of the camp were being reshaped by the military developments occurring beyond its boundaries. Conversations among prisoners during this period often focused on the meaning of the evacuations and the rumors circulating about the progress of the war. Women who had heard fragments of news during work assignments or from other prisoners attempted to interpret what these developments might mean for the future. Some believed that the approaching armies might soon reach the region, while others remained uncertain about how the situation would unfold. These discussions took place quietly inside the barracks during the evening hours, when prisoners gathered after the day's routines had ended and reflected on the events taking place around them. Through these conversations, prisoners attempted to make sense of the changing circumstances that were gradually transforming the environment of the women's camp. The evacuation of prisoners from Auschwitz-Birkenau therefore represented a significant moment in the final phase of the camp's history. The organized movement of inmates away from the complex altered the daily life of the women's camp and signaled that the system which had governed the camp for years was entering its concluding stage. As columns of prisoners left the compound and traveled toward other destinations within the concentration camp network, the familiar routines of Birkenau continued for those who remained, even as the larger context surrounding the camp moved steadily toward its final outcome. Chapter 10, Segment 3: Liberation, Memory, and the End of the Women's Camp. As the final phase of the war unfolded across Eastern Europe in early 1945, the events taking place beyond the fences of Auschwitz-Birkenau eventually reached the camp itself. The movements of armies across the region had already begun influencing the administration of the camp through the evacuations and prisoner transfers that took place during the preceding months. Columns of prisoners had been marched away from Birkenau toward other camps further west, and trains carrying groups of inmates had departed as the SS authorities attempted to reorganize the concentration camp system in response to the approaching front lines. Yet despite these efforts, the military situation continued to shift rapidly, and the remaining prisoners inside Auschwitz-Birkenau experienced the final days of the camp under conditions shaped by uncertainty and change. For the women who remained inside the compound, daily routines continued for a time even as the broader structure of the camp administration began to dissolve. Roll calls were still conducted, and prisoners gathered in the familiar assembly areas between the rows of barracks, where guards confirmed the numbers recorded in administrative records. Work assignments were still organized, though the scale of activity within the camp had begun to decline as many prisoners had already been evacuated to other locations. The compound that had once been filled with large populations of inmates and constant movement between labor detachments now appeared quieter in comparison with earlier periods of the camp's operation. Barracks that had once held crowded sleeping areas sometimes contained fewer prisoners than before, reflecting the transfers and evacuations that had taken place during the previous weeks. The administrative presence of the SS also began to diminish as the situation surrounding the camp changed. Personnel who had previously supervised the daily routines of the compound prepared to leave the area, and the organizational structure that had governed the camp for years gradually weakened. For prisoners observing these developments, the shift in activity created a sense that the long-standing system of the camp was approaching its conclusion. Conversations inside the barracks increasingly focused on rumors about the approaching armies and the possibility that the camp might soon be reached by forces advancing from the east. Many prisoners had already heard fragments of information about the progress of the war through earlier conversations with fellow inmates or through observations made during work assignments outside the compound. Now those rumors seemed closer to becoming reality as the sounds and movements associated with the changing military situation began to reach the region surrounding Auschwitz. In late January 1945, Soviet forces advancing through southern Poland entered the area around the Auschwitz complex. By the time these troops arrived, many of the SS personnel responsible for operating the camp had already withdrawn, and large numbers of prisoners had been evacuated during the earlier stages of the retreat. However, thousands of prisoners still remained within the camp, including many women who had not been included in the evacuation transports. When the advancing soldiers entered the grounds of Auschwitz and Birkenau, they encountered a camp complex that had been partially abandoned by its administrators, but still contained prisoners who had survived the final weeks of the camp's operation. For these prisoners, the arrival of the Soviet troops marked the end of the camp system that had defined their lives for months or years. The liberation of Auschwitz did not immediately resolve all of the challenges faced by the prisoners who remained there. Many were physically exhausted after enduring long periods of labor, limited food supplies, and the harsh conditions of life inside the barracks. Medical teams and support personnel accompanying the advancing forces began organizing assistance for the survivors, providing care and helping to stabilize the situation within the campgrounds. At the same time, the soldiers and journalists who entered the camp began documenting what they saw within the complex. Photographs, reports, and testimonies collected during these early days after liberation contributed to the historical record of Auschwitz and the experiences of the prisoners who had lived there. For the women who had survived imprisonment in the Birkenau women's camp, liberation marked the end of one chapter of their lives and the beginning of another. Some prisoners remained in the area temporarily while medical care and administrative arrangements were organized, while others eventually returned to their home countries or traveled to new locations where they could rebuild their lives after the war. The barracks, fences, and watchtowers of Birkenau remained standing as physical reminders of the system that had once operated within the camp. In the years that followed, the site became a place of historical reflection and remembrance where visitors could learn about the events that had taken place there during the war. The history of the women's camp inside Birkenau is therefore remembered not only through the physical structures that remain but also through the testimonies of the women who lived within those barracks and endured the routines of the camp. Their experiences contribute to a broader understanding of the concentration camp system and the ways in which individuals navigated life within one of the largest camps established during the Second World War. Today, the grounds of Auschwitz-Birkenau stand as a memorial and museum where the history of the camp continues to be studied and remembered. The rows of barracks and the open fields of Birkenau remain quiet, yet they carry the memory of the thousands of women who once lived there, preserving the historical record of a place that played a central role in the events of the Holocaust. The fields around Birkenau are quiet today. The wooden barracks still stand in long rows across the open ground, and the railway tracks that once carried transports into the camp remain preserved as part of the landscape. Visitors who walk through the site now move slowly between the buildings, reading the signs, looking across the wide fields, and reflecting on the history that unfolded here. The women who once lived inside these barracks came from many different countries, cultures, and communities. Their lives were interrupted by war, deportation, and imprisonment, yet their stories remain part of the historical memory that continues to be studied and remembered today. The women's camp of Auschwitz-Birkenau was not just a place on a map. It was a complex system shaped by geography, administration, labor, survival, and human endurance. Understanding how it functioned helps us understand the wider structure of the Nazi camp system and the experiences of the people who were forced to live within it. Today the ground is silent, but the history remains, and remembering it is part of understanding it. If you value calm, detailed, and respectful long-form Holocaust history, consider subscribing to In and Out Nazi Germany for more complete historical documentaries like this one.